hello out there on the stationary plane Earth. Everybody listening, so far there's 0 live viewers, but I'm sure that will change shortly since we just went live. So, for those of you listening to the archives, welcome to Static Plane Truth. Oops. Never remember to mute myself on that. There we go. I'm getting better and faster at that. And just wanted to welcome you guys to Season 1, Episode 13 of Static Plane Truth, where we basically discuss the scientific reasoning behind this movement, where at least most of our panel members are questioning what we've been taught, questioning the globe, trying to find that curvature, trying to find, evidence for axial rotation, orbital momentum, and, it seems as if under every rock that we look and in the sky or any experiments that we can do to try to find this curvature and axial rotation, for starters, seems to not be there. And so most of the panel members on this show are sort of at least of that mindset, although we do have several different models that we're kicking around. As far as I'm concerned, that's how science works. You have to have a theory. You test that theory using experimentation, and competing theories can often be sometimes merged, if you will. So some ideas or some laws that work on a flat Earth can also work, theoretically on a globe Earth or a convex Earth. But at the end of the day, we have to base our scientific determination of where we live based on, I hate to overuse the phrase, but empirical, repeatable evidence, experiments, things that we can verify, things that we can observe, and things that anybody can replicate. And that's where we've run into such a huge problem, with entities like NASA, where we have to take their word for it. We have to, there's very few people, really nobody, who can replicate or even demonstrate what NASA claims to have achieved. And like if you look at the recent Go Fast rocket launch, where I think it gets up to 73 miles, and there's very good evidence that there's no curvature even at those levels. It's just the more and more we look into this thing as unbiased, objective, scientific truth seekers, the more and more it seems as if the conventional, typical explanation of things, being the heliocentric model, just don't cut it. They don't stack up with reality. And so, as diligent scientists, it's sort of our duty to seek out the truth, even if it means ridicule, to seek out the truth, even if it means we need to let go of belief systems that we really, really enjoy. I mean, who doesn't love Star Wars and, the thought of some star up there with a planet orbiting it, somebody up there looking at our star thinking, I wonder if there's anybody up there thinking about this star. So at the end of the day, though, when we realize, or when we've sort of seen ample evidence that the stars and the wandering stars and the celestial bodies aren't these, multi light year distant bodies similar to our sun and so-called galaxy, it becomes apparent to the serious flat earther that the Earth, the world, is special. The lights that we can see in the night sky are definitely mysterious, and we can try to discern all sorts of things based on observing them, but at the end of the day, we really need to focus our experimentation at the basics here on the ground in reality, where again, we look for things like curvature or experiment and try to find axial rotation, and it simply isn't there. So that was just sort of my introduction, and we've got a little bit of a live viewing audience so far. So at this point, what I want to do quickly is just kick off introductions to the panel member. Starting from left to right, we've got the lovely Fran Anderson. Fran, how have you been doing?
Good, thanks, John. How are you?
I am great, stationary and perpendicular to the horizon. What you been up to? I know last time we had sort of discussed the mirror video, which I think is great. I watched it twice. I shared it, thumbs it up, and all that good stuff. I don't know if Kristen has seen it, had a chance to see it, but since you mentioned that, I've sort of been looking for reflections and that sort of thing in different scenarios. And I'm seeing more and more of it. It's like, I don't know, sort of a bad analogy, but until you ever heard of the new Dodge Charger, you never see one. And then once you've seen one and you know about the new Dodge Charger, then you see them everywhere. And it's, to me, it's sort of like that. Once you're sort of given an idea or you're sort of thinking along a new line of thought, then you start to see these sort of, in this case, reflections sort of popping up in unexpected places. So I don't know, maybe you want to elaborate on that or just skip
Yeah,
over
that's
the.
actually kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about today. If there was a chance, I wanted to kind of share a little bit of some of the little more things that I have been thinking and pondering since that video, and just share that with everybody. Right now, I'm working on getting the visuals for it,
Yeah.
so I'm not quite ready to share yet. But
Take
you
your
know what? And it might be hard, but I will do my best to try to show using visuals of kind of some of the ideas that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Take your time. Take whatever time you need to get prepared. So no pressure. And moving right along, we've got the lovely and charming Kristen Wolf. Kristen, how you been, gal?
Oh, I'm hanging in there, John. How about you?
I'm doing all right. All things considered, it's living, breathing, another day. Looking forward to tomorrow. So what more can we ask for?
Yes, it's for sure. It's beautiful springtime weather most days, and I'm living in the mountains now, and so I don't get to see any flat horizons anymore. And I must say I'm kind of missing that because I'm used to the Bay Area where I could see it all the time. I actually used to spend a lot of time on the bay. For the last few years, I was in the Bay Area. That kind of kept me going, actually, being near the bay. And that
Ooh,
became
Kristen found curvature. Kristen found curvature. No, I'm kidding.
I am surrounded by an just just a never ending, it seems like, expanse of topography that's very exaggerated, I must say.
Yeah, well, and it's really interesting too. Just the other day, I was driving or riding north towards, because I live south of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and so we were riding north towards them. And some of those Blue Ridge Mountains, even though, here our elevation is somewhere, I want to say 275 meters above sea level, these mountains that are obviously, 50, 60, 70 miles in the distance are barely visible. But it's just so plain that those mountains are on the same plane. I mean, pun intended. But
Yes.
it's just these simple observations that that a mountain, regardless of its height, if it's 50 or 100 miles away, we should be able to detect some curvature. And so even in a mountainous area, I know it is a little bit more difficult to get that beautiful, sort of flat horizon. But were you to launch a weather balloon, you'd find, and this is according to, sort of my nerd days as a globe earther, but and I've said this before, but on average, the Earth itself, pound for pound, is, well, in a spherical sense, it's more perfectly spherical than a billiards ball, which means, like, if you were to take a billiards ball under an electro scanning microscope or whatever, it would have more, mountains and crevices than the Earth on average. So essentially, like Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the Earth, would be nothing in comparison to the tallest mountain under an electron scanning microscope on a billiards ball. Now, if you apply that same sort of logic to a flat Earth, then I think it's safe to say that the Earth itself is, well, flatter on average than a CD would probably be a good analogy. And so anyway, if you were to launch a weather balloon up there from those mountainous areas, you'd soon get that same effect. It just might cost you a little bit more money than walking out to the beach. Right?
Wow.
That,
That was
that,
really something.
well, that's what we find, though. I mean, and I've been watching a lot of weather balloon footage, and it's like the more I find, the more I'm convinced and confirmed that, you launch one of these things even from a pretty high mountain, eventually It's going to sort of level out. The distant mountains or the distant peaks are going to sort of merge with the horizon, and you're going to get the same sort of effect. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with atmospheric refraction. We have a finite visible distance depending on how thick the atmosphere is with water vapor and that sort of thing. But yeah, maybe you'll do a weather balloon launch and get another peek at the flat equidistant circle horizon.
It'd be fun. I mean, I keep thinking, just how high would I have to get up? Just as little as possible, but to be able to see a flat horizon from where I am, and I can't figure it out. I got to get on Google Earth or something and maybe try to measure it out that way. But I haven't really been on Google Earth much personally, and I would like to. But I guess you have to actually do more than just call it up on Google. How does that work? I don't know. That's a different conversation, but I need to get on Google Earth and check it out, what my elevation is here and how it really, I don't get the whole sunset here either because of the local mountains, and so it's sort of maybe cut off the last, say, 10, 15 minutes. It's hard to say really for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Topography is going to have a big, huge difference in sunrise and sunset, especially like if you live, for example, on the side of a mountain. Let's say you live on the east side of the mountain. Sunrise is going to come much more quickly, and sunset's going to be very abrupt and quick. And again, if you hop over to the other side of the mountain, it'll still be daylight. So yeah, topography has a big impact on that. And in terms of how high up would you need to go, I think the troposphere would definitely get it, if you can get out beyond that. And one thing that I learned pretty recently is that if you can, and this is probably cheaper than a weather balloon and easier to retrieve, if you can get some of these real high-tech, pimped-out kites, these kites, you can fly them up to ridiculous altitudes. I looked it up on Guinness. This guy in Australia got his kite up to, I think it was like 5,000 meters. It was like 15,000 feet, right, or whatever, more than that, somewhere along the lines of that. So short of a weather balloon, that's just a suggestion to anybody out there that might have tons and tons of string and a kite that they don't know what to do with. Strap a non-GoPro, couple of very light cameras on there and see if you can get any any good observations or measurements from even mountainous regions. I think that might give you sort of an advantage if you're on the top of a mountain, especially if one side of that is coastal. But I don't guess that would be the case for you, would it?
Now this brings up well, I've got a lot of good southern exposure, but just because somehow there's a little bit of mountain cropping into the west, it just cuts off the end of the sunset. But this brings up a bigger thing I've been thinking about lately, about just how to me, the amount of how obvious the parallax is between us and the sun. Just moving a short distance is amazing. For instance, part of the property that I'm right now living on is about 100 feet up from the other half of it, and so half of it, the low half, is sort of in a canyon in effect, and so we get the early sunset obviously in this part of the property, in the low part where I'm sitting now, in fact. And so the upper part is where we get the whole day of sun, and so you can go up there and get a whole extra hour or more of daylight every day, and then see the sunset from up there. Pretty much what can be seen, and then I can take a walk even further up the hill and see the sunset a little longer, of course, which lends to what I'm saying already, which this amount of parallax being so obvious between ourselves and the celestial bodies, that you can move. I've noticed you can move from east to west, or am I saying this from north to south of the, I might still be saying it wrong, but of the sun, just walking, 20 yards, you can be literally visually from one side of it to the other in a short amount of distance.
Yeah, totally. I've noticed that. And another thing too that I've sort of stumbled on in one of my recent videos within the last month or so is that parallax works the same way when you're talking about raising an altitude in the stars. And so, like, just as an example, if you're looking at stellarium, which is always imaging the stars and where they should be from the ground, if you raise up an altitude, 10 or 20,000 feet, then based on the research and the sort of juxtaposition that I've done with real images and stellarium, yeah, there's a great deal of parallax change, let's just say, in terms of the moon and the background stars from 20,000 feet than there is from ground level. And so to me, that's very telling. You know, if the moon was 250,000 miles away and those stars were, 50 quadrillion miles away, raising up 10 or 20,000 feet shouldn't change that much in terms of parallax, but indeed it really does appear to do so. So, yeah, with
Right.
you there.
Yeah, and another example that recently came up is the idea that people get sunburned easier at higher altitudes. And I thought, well, okay, that that makes sense in a way, but then it makes a lot more sense to me on a flat Earth, of course, when we're talking about a much more local sun, where then a few thousand feet up in the mountains is going to make a difference, whereas a few thousand feet to a 93 million mile away sun, I can't imagine would make enough of a difference to give you more of a sunburn.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess what they would say is there's less atmosphere at those higher altitudes, and so you're getting more of the UV rays. Um,
Right.
Yes, that too.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's
that's
going to
what
be
they
the
say.
argument. But
Perhaps.
I watched a video the other day, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with. Well, I'll just use the abbreviation BS detector. BS
I'm not
detector.
familiar.
The
Not familiar.
YouTube channel, and he's actually done some pretty good work. One of the videos that he did was just so very simple and obvious to me that I just laughed out loud. And the guy has a pretty good sense of humor. He does sort of like, maybe I'm confusing it with someone else, but he like slows down his voice, and so it does sound kind of creepy and it's kind of hard to listen to. But if you can get past that, the point that he made, and God, maybe I should try to diagram this out, but I'll just try to explain it, is that the equator, they say the equator gets the most direct sunlight because it's at the center of the globe, and, that's why it's hottest on average, is because it gets the most direct sunlight throughout the year. But if you actually, start modeling this out and trying to apply this theory, then technically that, if the sunlight is coming in as like a, all parallel lines, a giant wall of light hitting the Earth at essentially, the same angle, all these rays of light are hitting the Earth at the same angle. If the Earth is tilted, then the equator wouldn't be getting that direct sunlight. In fact, it would be like well above the north of the tropics. And if you really actually animate this out and model this out, the polar region should be like boiling. And he didn't go so far as to say this, but this is sort of my conclusion, is that if we lived in a heliocentric system, the polar regions should be boiling in their respective summers, but they just warm up a little bit. They just become slightly more temperate, much more temperate in the north versus the south. But he did an excellent job of showing in this very brief video that this whole idea of the equator being the center is wrong, because the entire thing's supposedly at a tilt. And so the direct sunlight, if there is this wall of parallel sunlight coming in, it should be hitting sort of like north of the tropics, in the northern summer at a direct line of sight. And technically we should have two equators. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but if you actually model this out, look at the angles involved, he made a very good point that we should have two, on average highest temperature areas, two equators in that sense. But instead we've just got this really bizarre spinning globe on a tilt that, theoretically it kind of makes sense that that's what causes the seasons. But when you actually scrutinize this whole idea that the angle of the sunlight is what causes the seasons, it doesn't stack up. And so to, getting sunburn at higher elevations, I wouldn't necessarily say that in a heliocentric model that being closer to the sun would make a difference. But in a flat Earth model, if the sun is actually a lot closer, like I believe it is, then it could be a combination of things. I mean, maybe you're a mile closer to the sun. Maybe there is less atmosphere to sort of protect you from those UV rays. So, it could be a combination of things. But, yeah, interesting observation. Sorry, didn't mean to steal the topic, but I go off.
Oh, not at all. There was no clear focus. There was just sort of, resonating with a couple of things you'd mentioned that was sort of side topics, and then another on that same note of getting sunburned more in some places than others. Apparently, Australia is another good example of that, and I wonder, there's more to talk about with why in the southern hemisphere that is happening, and I don't know how much that may also tie into the lower, we were talking barometric, I guess, pressure last week, or Saturday rather, in the south, and that might be part of that there too, with the more, being more, there's possibly more to it, so many things to it that I can't even begin to go there probably.
Yeah, there's just so much data. I mean, there's so much data that we have to sift through, and we really have to check and really just dump all of our assumptions at the door. Because,
yes.
I mean, one thing that's very obvious to me is that if you try to bring heliocentric assumptions to this endeavor, to this scientific experiment, if you will, or this hypothesis, then you're never going to get anywhere, because the two models are incompatible with one and the other. And so, yeah, I think it's important that we do ask these sort of tough questions, like you mentioned. And I think that the explanations that we have aren't sufficient. But then again, that's because most of science, and I guess you could say the brightest minds, or at least the most invested into education minds, have been, looking up at the stars for answers, for crying out loud, trying to figure out what happened, 13.5 billion years ago by looking through a telescope, as if. And
right.
it leads back to the LIGO. I mean, we talked about this before too, but it leads back to the LIGO so-called discovery of this binary supermassive black hole collision, which was, for all intents and purposes, a blip on a chart, which they used CGI imagery to make this dazzling animation of two black holes converging. But that's, it's just all conjecture, it's numbers, it's assumptions, and I'm not sure how I got off on that tangent, but I mean, it's all of their arguments sort of come back to, okay, everyone knows the Earth is a globe, and so if we see this blip on a chart, that means we have gravity waves, and let's pay some, 3D animator $50,000 to make this animation, or a team of them, $5 million. I don't know how much they spent on that. But all in all, it was just a CGI movie. That's all it was.
Right. It's just amazing to me. They don't tell us, right, that the stars move with us. I don't know why they wouldn't, when they expect us to believe the Earth is, going so far, so fast around and chasing the sun through the galaxy forever and ever. And, why? So, but the stars stay in their relative positions, right, all the time, and have not changed. So why didn't they just tell us the stars stay with us, that they're our stars, they're kind of Earth stars?
That would make more sense, but their argument is, of course, the vast distances involved, which are all theoretical, and they're based on the assumption that the sun is 93 million miles away, which is based on the assumption that the Earth is a sphere. Right?
Yeah. And it still doesn't seem to make sense that the parallax involved would work out in their model with even these trillions of light years away that the stars are supposed to be. It just doesn't add up. They're talking about, even how they, want to just minimize it all, the insignificance of it and so on, but then eclipses that type of example, this type of what it takes for these bodies to line up like that when they're supposed to be 400 times smaller and larger than one another, and the distance of one another and so on. And it's like, come on, this is just, well, it's all arbitrary. Okay, yeah. It's really neat how they can just cherry pick the explanation for things like it's, and not seem to acknowledge how obviously designed and precise the whole system is, even for their model to be possible, mind you, if it were.
Beautiful.
So, yeah, it's pretty crazy.
it's beautiful in how, you know, you have these perfectly repeating cycles, which to me in a heliocentric model are impossible. But one of the biggest points that just totally demolishes the heliocentric theory is the North Pole star Polaris. And I mean, like you said, yes, we're supposedly traveling through space, and they argue the distances. But my point has nothing to do with the distances or parallax. It has to do with the supposed axial precession, which is what supposedly causes the precession of the equinoxes. And if that's the case, then the north axis should be precessing or not pointing in the same direction by 1 degree every 72 years. And it's not like it's a step-by-step thing, you know, 72 years, click a degree, 72 years, click a degree. It's phasing through 1 degree every 72 years. And as long as people have been observing the night sky, and for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, the North Pole star Polaris has been directly above our so-called axis of rotation, which to me completely disproves axial precession altogether, because if that star they claim is 433 light years away, which is either 2.5 or 25.5. It's in the quadrillions of miles, but it's 433 light years is what they claim. If you were off even by a fraction of a degree of that alignment, you would no longer see that perfect, you know, we've all seen the time-lapse footage of the North Pole star with all the stars circling it. We should have a new North Star every certainly 70 years, maybe 150 years to be very conservative, but thousands of years? This debunks axial precession altogether. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just obvious. It's kind of, I don't know. I just don't understand. I don't understand how normal people like us can see this, and then these brainiacs out there don't see it. I don't understand this. I don't consider myself so great or whatever that, you know, I don't consider myself so great and better, but yet I just don't understand why.
Well,
Why they don't understand this.
I know why. It's because you actually gave the topic a fair shake. That's it. That's the only difference, and that's a big difference, and it's up to each individual person to do that. Now, hold that thought. I didn't realize, but we have since gained Jason. Jason, how you been doing, man? What you up to?
Hey, guys, girls, ladies, gentlemen.
Hey.
I'm doing good. How's everybody?
Doing good.
Awesome, man. Awesome. We were just sort of talking about how preposterous the heliocentric model is.
I agree. I kind of want to. I have some input about why the question was posed is, and I think it's Fran, right? Is that right, Fran?
Yes.
And Fran said, "Why do I, and I don't consider myself to be, you know, this highly. I don't know. I don't want to say the words wrong.
That's all right. You can paraphrase it.
Paraphrase, highly intelligent person. Why don't the scientists see?" And as John knows, I'm very good friends with a scientist that works at a very large company, and like he told me tonight, we were talking about that very thing. We were talking about the Art Bell video, John, that you did, and he basically tore Art Bell to shreds and said that he said that what he did to you goes against science. That science is all about questions. There are no stupid questions. That's the point of science. That when there's a question raised, you're supposed to try to answer it. You're not supposed to say it's a stupid question. So what he then went on to say is that these scientists are trying to continue to get their grant money, and if they go against these theories, that their grants go away. So more or less, science is bought and paid for now by big government and big money. So why would a scientist that studies the heliocentric model come out and say that it's false? They're admittedly going to be ridiculed, like you were ridiculed by Art Bell, and then they're going to lose their grant money. And that's exactly why they do it. It's nothing to do with opening their eyes. They have been indoctrinated in the heliocentric model for years. They studied it, and they're not going to go against it. No matter what we do or say, they're going to continue to be beholden to the dollars.
Yeah, and I do definitely agree, and that's even, I think scientists are even more difficult to sort of get to look at this scientifically, as bizarre as that sounds. But in terms of an average person, and I would consider myself an average person for most of my life. I was a globe earther. You know, I did well in school, went to college, you know, did my fair share of work, manual labor, professional work, all, you know, all that sort of thing. And so I'm a fairly typical person, but for 34 years of my life, I believed this very model. And I think that the only difference between me and any other average person, and like Fran had mentioned, or had sort of queried, is I think the difference is that we just simply gave this theory a fair shake. And that's really all it takes. Is you really have to sort of again, be scientific about this, look at this unbiased, you know, look at the data, compare the data in both models, and that data can be everything from, you know, like we said, curvature, axial rotation, the supposed 250 million year cycle of the sun, which has obviously been proven, because we know there's scientists that have been around studying the cycle of the sun for hundreds of millions of years, of course. But you know, it's all theory, and unfortunately, most people are going to, you know, defer to these scientific minds who have all arrived at this conclusion over hundreds of years. And it's just unthinkable of them that, you know, all of these people that they've respected, Einstein, their teacher, you know, all these people, NASA, you know, all these entities and people that they've respected, and they've really built a lot of, unfortunately to say, people build a lot of their id, you know, their ID, their psyche, on what is presented to them from a third party through these mainstream media outlets. And it's very sad because these mainstream media outlets are, in a sense, opinion factories, but they're also sort of plopping out carbon copies of people who think that they have a firm understanding and original ideas about nature. But in fact, you know, most of these people are just so far from the truth that their worldview is incompatible with what we're trying to explain to them as being the truth. And so that's the issue. It's just that they're so ingrained, and especially scientists, because they have their reputation, they have their livelihood, their business, their future, all wrapped up into these books that they've written, these books that they've written, and, you know, all of their thesis, and, you know, all of their presentations that they've done. But honestly, I would respect a scientist, let's just say, for example, Lawrence Krauss. I would, and he's just a theoretical physicist, so that really isn't even science. It's lyrical hyperbole. But let's just say Lawrence Krauss came out and admitted, you know, I was wrong. The heliocentric model doesn't work. The Big Bang is bull, and the Earth is a stationary plane. I would respect him. I mean, I'm sure everyone on this call would respect him, but in terms of the scientific community, he would be ridiculed, shunned, branded as a heretic, and never work again in the business. And so, you know, obviously scientists have a lot more vested into this than others. So there you have it, right?
I agree. If you examine many things in science, and I talk a lot about climate science when I get on these discussions, because there's some parallels there. I mean, we have, I think, 16 to 18 attorney generals that are talking about prosecuting people that disagree with man-made climate change, and I would compare that to back when people said the Earth was flat, and they would put you in jail for saying that it was a globe. It, if we were truly open-minded to science the way it's supposed to be, the actual definition of science, we wouldn't be talking about prosecuting people who disagree with an obvious flawed theory, and that none of the climate science none of the models work, none of the predictions have come true, and yet we're signing treaties, we're putting tax dollars towards this, we have hundreds and hundreds of scientists that are being paid to study this, no different than the billions of dollars we put into NASA. I mean, you have to think about all the people who would be out of jobs, out of work, that study these things. I mean, we obviously would have to start studying the flat Earth if people would agree on that model. But these people aren't going to give up their livelihood, and they're not going to be shunned, because if they come out and say we were wrong, the Earth is actually a flat plane, then who would believe them? I mean, we're fighting against a lot of there's a lot of tough odds against us, I guess, so to speak.
Well, and could you imagine, though, let's just say from the birth of, and we'll go back to 1955 when Admiral Byrd did his South Polar Expedition, Operation High Jump. Let's just say hypothetically that up to that point, the powers that be assumed the Earth was a sphere, and that's what they thought it was. And up to that point, they realized, holy crap, you know, Einstein, Newton, all these guys were wrong. The South Pole keeps going. And actually, there's some, well, I guess you could say tales or legends of mariners going beyond the South Pole or beyond the southern region and finding other worlds. There's also legends, even going back to ancient Norse legends, which were purportedly carried out in somewhat recent history by a father and son crew who went to the fabled land beyond the north. And according to these accounts, and I'm not saying they're factual, but it appears that there are large masses of lands or even other worlds that are very close by ours. They just so happen to be separated by either the north and or south sort of ice barriers, which we call the poles. And so, you know, with that being said, I think that there's a lot of control involved. The powers that be want us sort of in the middle here. They want us, you know, like cattle. You know, if you've ever worked on a dairy farm, you don't want your cattle spread out over, you know, 100 acres. You want them pretty much corralled in the same area where you can tag them, keep track of them, and do whatever. And it seems to me that's what this whole globe structure grid is to do, is to essentially, you know, sever our pioneering spirit, sever that manifest destiny sort of, you know, morale that we had in, well, killing a bunch of Native Americans, but developing the country of America. So, anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm actually holding a globe in my hand, and
Bastard, I'm booting you. No, I'm kidding.
and when I've talked to a couple people, they say to me, you know, when I talk about flat Earth, they're like, well, why? And I say, well, think about it this way. If we're on a spinning globe hurtling through space, there's one way off of it, and that's on a rocket, right? Somebody else has to put us into orbit and send us somewhere else. But if the Earth is a stationary flat plane and there is something beyond the ice wall, then if we don't like what's going on with our government or what's going on our part of the plane, then we can just pick up and go somewhere else. And I truly believe that Admiral Byrd did find something, and like you said, being herded like cattle, if we all start to find out that there's something somewhere else and we don't like the political landscape or we don't like the wars that we continually fight, then we might pick up and go somewhere else, and they don't want us to do that.
Absolutely not, because if the world at large knew, hey, and there's this thing called Barrington Strait in the far southern, you know, polar region where we can go to this place called the Iron Republic, which may be total fantasy, but it may be true, then I think people would at least try, and I don't think they want us doing that. I think they want us well away from the topic. And again, they've done a very, I would say, excellent and superb job of doing it. By giving us this preposterous model of a globe, but they've convinced us that it's real. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no way off. There's no, I mean, it really does go against, I guess you could say, biblical or ancient, you know, belief systems or ancient science, ancient knowledge. And I think it is very much for control. But you know, we're slowly but surely chipping away at that. I think NASA's taken some pretty brutal hits. The likes of Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know, he's taken some pretty brutal hits, dropping his microphone to prove gravity, when everyone knows that's just a demonstration of what goes up must come down. But ladies, thoughts so far?
Yeah, wanted to ask you guys about something you know, just talk about something I found interesting, talking about that Admiral Byrd. on that famous video that you often see on YouTube where they interviewed Admiral Byrd on a radio show,
Okay.
and at the end of the interview, the reaction on the guys' faces were just amazing. So they had asked him what he thought was the most important value, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact words, but
Sure.
they said, what was the most important value that one needed to survive in Antarctica? And then they were expecting an answer like, you know, fortitude of body or fortitude of spirit, you know, something along those lines. You know what he said?
Warm clothes and water, for one.
Right. Well, you would expect something more like that. His answer was loyalty. That's what you needed to survive in Antarctica. And the guys that were interviewing, they didn't even know what to say. They're like, and that about concludes this interview.
Yeah.
It's just kind of crazy. You know, he's like, yeah, you need loyalty. And he says, people told me that, you know, I wouldn't be able to do this. And I'm paraphrasing. You know, I wouldn't be able to do this, you know, because people would just eat each other up being alone. You know, kind of The Shining. You would be like The Shining where you just go crazy or something. So that's why he was saying you needed loyalty, was so that, you know, you wouldn't try to kill each other. And I found that to be a very interesting answer to that interview. And then the people's reactions were also interesting because they were not expecting that either. They were expecting like what everyone else would expect. You'd expect, yeah, you need to have a really strong heart, like you got to have good spirit, and you got to have a lot of fortitude and a lot of stick-with-itness and a lot of strength or something, anything, pick any of those. But no, he said loyalty. So
well, the other thing
that
too
kind of interesting.
that you might expect is like 2,000 seamen, several icebreakers, a couple of aircraft carriers, and a big plane that allowed him to fly beyond the South Pole. That might be one thing that helped, but yeah, loyalty, that is kind of bizarre. And you know, the other really bizarre thing, and it is discussed a bit, but maybe we can unpack it a little bit more, is that you know, and if we're going to take what he, you know, we're going to take his reports at face value, which you can call it naive. But we can take it at face value, or we can read between the lines. He was a military man. He was also involved in Freemasonry, and so he's not going, or he's not necessarily going to be able to tell us everything. But one of the things that he did mention, and this was live on TV, he mentioned it several times, they had so-called evidence, you know, radio pings, evidence that the Antarctica itself is rich in all sorts of valuable, you know, think plutonium, oil, gas, probably gold. It's just anything you can think of. He even mentioned that they believed that it was once tropical underneath the many, you know, hundreds of meters of permafrost or ice or whatever. And so one of the things that he concluded was that we should expect to see a great deal of activity in the South Polar region over the next 100 years. So, you know, it's been 75 or so now, and what we saw was immediately after that was the Antarctic Treaty signed, which is essentially prevented, well, ultimately corporations from doing business out there, which is sort of counterintuitive. Especially when you think back on the last 20 years. I mean, how many oil spills? You remember that huge debacle off the Gulf of Mexico where they were just spewing oil into the Gulf for like weeks and they couldn't cap it. The Exxon Valdez disaster. Then you've got things like fracking, where they're just basically, you know, trying to get every last bit of natural gas out from under the ground, and it's linked to earthquakes. I mean, there's just all these things. Deforestation in order to get, they're even blowing up the entire mountains just to get at the last little bit of coal that's there. So they're basically destroying our world, especially it's all over the United States. I mean, it's just ridiculous when, excuse me for 1 second, but aren't we supposed to be able to go to the South Pole and get all this stuff and not screw up our ecosystem? Now, furthermore, I think it would be much, much easier to go to the South Pole and do that sort of thing than it is to go up to an asteroid and mine for things. But NASA that's exactly what they're planning to do. I believe they call it the Osiris, if I'm not mistaken. It's the Osiris mission, where they're probing big meteoroids or whatever, just to see if it's feasible to drill on. Now, does that really make sense to any of you guys, honestly? Does it make sense to just ignore the Antarctic? Let's not drill there for oil and coal and blah, 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 but let's take our chances, even assuming a heliocentric model. Let's take our chances with drilling on a frickin' meteoroid that's zipping through space a gazillion miles an hour. I mean, is that just not ridiculous to you guys as it is to me?
Yeah, it is. They have it's an opportunity to make money, and it's not being utilized. It's a great source, and it's not being utilized, and that's just really suspicious.
The reason you would go or start planning on mining on asteroids is another way to continue to fund NASA. How long can they possibly continue to fund it for the reasons that they're funding it for? And then,
well, they do play with water bubbles in space, so
Yeah.
that's very important research.
Going back to Antarctica, how do you know that we weren't told we have to stay out of there? How do we know that that treaty wasn't signed because whatever Admiral Byrd found told him we don't want people going beyond this plane or this part of the plane? I mean, that's a kind of a stretch in theory, but I don't know. How do we know that didn't happen? I mean,
well,
yeah, we don't. It could.
We don't, and this is my theory, and I won't interrupt. I'll let you finish. But I believe that since then there are a select handful of corporations that are within this sort of crony system that we've got that are probably actually out there getting all sorts of goodies. In fact, there has been some recent evidence to suggest that HAARP has been melting certain parts of the Antarctic to sort of help them get deeper. That's a little circumstantial, but I mean, to me, if I had to bet my money on it, I would bet that there are probably half a dozen, if not more, corporations scattered across the Antarctic getting all sorts of goodies and probably hoarding them in order to drive up the prices of those goods. And then when the market's at its peak, they'll dump it, and you know how they do their scams. But anyway, not to interrupt, but go ahead, bud.
No, I was just saying that we don't know anything about the region because we haven't been allowed to explore there. And it seems to me it doesn't really make any sense why you would stop the exploration there. It's got to be one of two things. You were either told to stop the exploration, or you found something that you didn't want anybody else to know about, and you're trying to conceal it, and that's why you stopped the exploration. There's no other reasonable explanation for why you would have somebody go out there, do exploration, have them come back, tell you this region's rich in resources, something that human beings need, and then abruptly cut it off, and then launch all your space programs and keep people out by signing a treaty that's probably one of the longest lasting treaties in the history of man.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, and we always have to look at the sort of social aspects of this in terms of the mass media. The mass media was priming people for space in terms of fiction books and sci-fi and videos and movies all the way from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s through the 60s to the point to where, and at that point they had most of the youth pretty much, I don't know, probably half of the youth jacked up on LSD, and so to me it was very easy to pull that sort of thing off, although I have heard from people who have claimed that they knew people that lived back then who thought it was all BS the whole time, but of course they never had a voice as much as the big media or like we do on the internet these days. So anyway. Have you guys heard anything about that, of people, contemporaneous with the Apollo missions thinking that it was just bull?
Well, my mom thinks the Apollo missions are complete bull, and she doesn't buy into any conspiracy theories at all. But she said since I was a kid that she didn't believe we went to the moon, and she was born in the 50s. that would have been something that would have been easy. You know, you would think that would have been ingrained in her, and she most certainly doesn't believe we went to the moon.
Awesome. Awesome. Give your mom a big hug and a kiss for me. Because yeah, me, I was raised on it. But that was it, though. That was the thing. I mean, even because that was like that's the bizarre thing about NASA is everybody loves them, and that should raise some red flags right there because it's a bipartisan thing. You know, Republicans and Democrats love them some NASA, but it's not just that either. It's like businessmen love NASA, hippies love NASA. You know, I don't know, metalheads love NASA, and probably some hip hop. You know, and I like all kinds of music, but whatever, you get the point. NASA is sort of this, at least in America and the other space agencies worldwide, are just respected almost by everybody, and their scientific assertions and conjecture are just gobbled up as facts. And it's just really amazing how they've done that, but it's obviously through the use of propaganda, you know, much like they did for the image of good old Uncle Walt Disney. I mean, that's sort of a case in point on a micro scale, but I mean, there's been a large degree of pro-NASA propaganda that's still pumped out to this day.
Well, and think about it this way, can you think of any, to take it a step further, can you think of any organization, I mean, you could line them up, FBI, CIA, Department of Education, EPA, government agency that generally isn't scrutinized by anybody, whether it be, as you said, as politicians or citizens or other governments. You don't hear anything critical of NASA, and it's you know, no one questions the budget. As a matter of fact, people are complaining that the budget has been knocked down for an agency that's basically produced nothing. I mean, what positive things has NASA produced for man?
Yeah, and by knocked down, they actually mean increased, but increased to a lesser degree than they wanted. So in 2016 they got 18 billion, and in 2017 they're going to get 20 billion, but they wanted something like 21 billion, so they call that a decrease when actually it was a $20 billion increase, which was only 2 billion more than last year. So, you know, it's all just ridiculous. You know, that's how they figure up their losses and profits. But yeah, I'd love to have a $2 billion decrease.
Yeah, really. About the Apollo missions, it seems that there's been a bit of, I don't know how big a push there's been for this. Seems to be a cover story that I caught on to in a couple of different places. And one is a recent video somebody put together covering this episode of, my goodness, Arrested Development, I believe it was, kind of Ron Howard produced, narrated as well by him, series on television, and where he takes the Jason Bateman character, if I'm saying his name right, into this like studio thing where he says him and his brother, Ron Howard's character says him and his brother used to hang out when they were kids because they grew up in the acting business, right?
Yes.
And that they saw them faking, you know, the first mission. And so he tells him, he said, oh yeah, the first mission, you know, wasn't real because they weren't ready. He said, but, you know, the later one in 71 or 72, I forget which year, he says, was real. And I've again seen this kind of cover story come up in other place where I think they kind of want the American public to, okay, you know, kind of like be just not, I sort of said it wrong, but they're sort of okay with the idea if the American public accepts that they probably didn't make it at, you know, in 69 because they had to just fake out the Russians, because this is the cover story. This is the cover story already, is that they want us to believe that, you know, we had to go to the moon to win the Cold War, to prove our military might. They put the American public in this panic for years that we had to beat the Russians to the moon.
Oh, and don't forget to fulfill JFK's promise as well.
Exactly.
That was really close to the heart to a lot of people.
You got it. I wanted to touch on that because that is such a big part of it, because I was going to say, after all, you know, JFK had promised them that this was going to happen. And so they can forgive NASA for faking it to get the job done as long as they believe that NASA actually went on the later missions. And of course, they didn't produce the photo, from what I understand, until the final mission, if I'm not mistaken, in 72. of Earth, the photo of Earth, that is,
Right, that
so-called.
famous blue marble, yeah.
Right. So it would seem, and then this other idea that, oh, they went in '69 to prove gravity, and then went, had to go again to get the picture of Earth, and these were the two things that hadn't been proven yet. It was, again, gravity that was necessary to the heliocentric model, but also necessary to it the idea that Earth is actually a sphere, and for all the other formulas and theories to also be true to go with that. And so very interesting indeed, because there are people, if people only knew how much we're being constantly hoaxed about what the state of affairs is in the world. And if we only could know the truth, even what's going on in Antarctica. I wanted to make a couple comments about that, but it didn't really work out. But if we jump back to that for a minute, or if we don't mind to, I would like to just say a couple things.
Yeah, absolutely, go for it.
I mean, I think, a lot of people feel like this is very much about more land, that they're hiding from us, and it may or may not be that, but I think there's something I wanted to say there that may or may not make sense right now, but I'll try anyway. I really think we would kind of be happy wherever we are if we really felt free. I don't think people necessarily. I think some people might be more natural-born explorers, but I think a lot of the explorer spirit, in some ways, comes from a want of freedom. And I feel like if we felt free naturally, or kind of, when I say naturally, I mean through the way that we're kind of socialized, we might not be as concerned about what else is there out there. But I think it's this thing of not feeling free that might really drive us. And so, again, that point may not have any kind of resonance right now, but it made sense when I jotted it down in case I got a chance to say it. And so the Admiral Byrd interview, too, interesting thing I noted about that is that he, right away, they asked him at first about the North. I think they may have directed him to speak about the North, if I'm not mistaken, but he right away says, well, the North they find is very livable, actually, and it's I kind of settled. I forget the way he said it exactly, but then he says it's all about the South. He really redirects the interview to be totally all about the South, and that's kind of interesting, because I think likewise in the South they probably easily could be not just maybe wanting to keep a pristine area of untapped resources for themselves, but perhaps as equally or more so, it might be about that it's quite inhabitable as well, and they don't want us to know it's inhabitable, and there's possibly already a lot of people living there, which I've come up with some tracks of research that point to that possibility. There's, along the same lines, the idea that they really might even just be hiding other civilizations that may or may not be more advanced, but they might be just different enough than us that they don't want us to know about them for whatever reasons. I mean, there just could be so much to it that may really not be as much about land, but I do think Antarctica is much bigger than they give us reason to believe. And also enough people have come up with a lot of evidence that there's a lot of areas that are seemingly quite inhabitable. They're not covered in ice. They're dry. They're desert-like. It seems like a different thing than we might imagine altogether. When you see some of those videos and pictures, there's quite an abundance of those that some people have started to put out over the last year. So there's a lot of things going on with Antarctica, to be sure, but it might be, what's really relevant is, can we be free where we are? It would be a shame to think that, okay, there's only this other place on Earth that we don't know about where people could actually be free. Because what would happen if we all tried to go there, if such a place exists, and how would that work? I mean, we need to kind of hopefully get to a point of finding true freedom in our sovereignty, which apparently is now an illegal thing to say, to speak, to say about ourselves, to claim ourselves as. It's a little out of hand. It's a little bit out of hand, whether they've got a fence around us or not. If we're not free where we are, that presents a bigger problem.
Well, it's really interesting, and just to sort of plug something that I just released the other day on my third channel. So if you guys hadn't seen it, it's 5 hours and 40 minutes, but it's actually an audiobook. And what I'm reading, and I did add some sound effects for ambience, so I spent a lot of time on it, and it was something that I started a while back and just finished up recently. But anyway, it's the account of a man named E.W. Barrington, just to give you the compressed version, who essentially was a political outcast in America, and he was well off, decided to convert all of his property and everything to gold. He set sail with a crew on a very nice vessel, and he was going to go just south as far as the seas would permit. And so what they did is they reached Antarctica, and they were trying to circumnavigate it, and they saw what appeared to be a channel flowing, south into, further into the Antarctic. And so, they sort of decided to check it out and look into it, and essentially a current just zipped them right through it. Apparently it was about 20-25 miles through. And as crazy as this sounds, but according to this story, that once they got through it, it got temperate very quickly as they headed what they thought was continuing to head south, but in fact they were heading north in a whole nother world, and landed ashore of a city that was, well, not to spoil the book, that was totally not here in this world, but did have English-speaking people who had sort of gotten lost on their way from, Europe and their immigration to the Americas in the 1600s. Now, this story, it does sound kind of unbelievable. There's parts of it that are very compelling in a flat Earth perspective, but it's this sort of literary work, and the accounts are not meant to be taken as fiction. They're written as if they're truthful. These sort of things are buried. It was a serial sort of thing in Florida Magazine in 1902, and nobody's ever heard of the story, and so I did just put that up in audiobook format a couple days ago because it's a very interesting story. Although I wasn't happy with the ending, I think the journey is the main point of the story. Now, also recently, I watched a similar account of a popular flat earther, of these two Norsemen who did a similar excursion to the north, and they found this land full of giants. And when the guy came back, his father was dead or whatever, but they basically put him in a loony bin for 26 years, and he had all these tales of this land beyond the north, where it gets very temperate once you get beyond the 90-degree north latitude. And so we do have these, I guess you could call them legends, but they're not presented as such. They're actually presented as actual accounts of people who have, and in the case of the southern excursion with E.W. Barrington, it was an extremely mild winter in the south, and so what normally would have been miles and miles of ice pack was apparently open sea, and so it was just happenstance that they were able to find this place. And he even believed that the strait that they went to was as steadfast as like the Strait of Gibraltar. However, in more severe southern winters, it can be clogged up with icebergs and ice and such. But anyways, not to get off on that tangent, I think that there is at least circumstantial and fairly recent, like within the last 150 years, of people going far south, long before the Antarctic Treaty, and finding ways through to other worlds and back. Now, this could all be fantasy, it could all be made up, but if it's true, then it really would explain a lot in terms of the Antarctic and the Arctic treaties.
Indeed, because the one other thing I wanted to say real quick about Admiral Byrd redirecting the interview to be all about the South begs the question of what's really going on in the North, and so I'm glad you brought it back to that, because it's that's where people who've looked into the Hollow Earth theory will recall his journals are based on his travels to the north, about finding the other civilization, dropping down into the lush valley, and then the controls of his plane being taken over by the other craft that surrounded his craft and his plane, and then kind of levitated it down to the ground, and they escorted him to their leader, so to speak, and he was given a message.
And I'm sorry, this was the accounts of whom? I'm sorry.
This was Admiral Byrd again. Sorry if I didn't say that
That
clearly, but
no, I thought that's what you said, but okay, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
people who've looked at the Hollow Earth theory, you know, it's all about the North. That particular excursion, if you will, where the journals were, or the journey on which the journals are based. So I've only looked into that briefly, but some people have gotten heavily into it, and I know one person who's been very seriously into that for years before finding out about the flat Earth, as a matter of fact. And so, actually, and it's funny, Mark Sargent's talked quite a bit about that. I've heard several times. And there's something else I wanted to mention about something he's been talking about with regard to curvature, visibility, and stuff that we could touch on at some point. But yeah, he's mentioned too that he really studied quite in depth. It sounds like the Hollow Earth theory, and that is one of those things that I would suggest might be perhaps partly. Maybe another cover story, or being used as another cover story.
And when you say hollow Earth, are we talking like concave inside of a sphere, or we're talking like hollow Earth as in possible underground, like more layers underground?
Oh, well, I figured you'd looked into it. I hope I'm calling it the right thing. I think it's Hollow Earth, but the idea is that, Earth is still as we know it, like we're supposed to believe as we know it. Spherical, spinning sphere, crazy land. And so, but that there's this, that it's also hollow and with a civilization on the inside. So that part's just like the concave Earth thing, but it doesn't change the outside being what we're supposed to believe it is. And then there's another sun in there and all that good stuff. And so, yeah, has anyone else looked into Hollow Earth, or is it just me? Am I the only one who went down that little rabbit hole on YouTube?
I haven't gone down that rabbit hole yet, but I intend to, because I think that there might be nuggets in there that,
right.
You know what I'm saying? So I definitely think it's worth looking into. You know how I'm into geology, and I talked about in some of my other videos about how even Nat Geo even admitted that underground caves, are some of the least explored places on the quote-unquote planet, as they would say. But it's supposedly they're supposed to be still very unexplored. So I definitely have a fascination with what's going on beneath us, and so I definitely intended to take a better look at this Hollow Earth theory.
Yeah, and from what I've always understood Hollow Earth theory, and maybe I guess there's probably several different flavors and extremities of it, but one thing's for sure, and I agree with Fran on this, and I've been, I wouldn't say spelunking, but I've definitely been in a lot of like tour caves, and it's just a really wonderful experience. If anybody has never been like on a tour where you go deep underground in the cave systems, it's just awesome. It's really, really, really cool. But yeah, the Earth itself, we think of the land underneath our feet as like solid and just solid layers upon layers. But in fact, it's more along the lines of, I guess you could compare it to a giant anthill with lots of different, passageways, and like Fran said, especially the underwater ones. I mean, this is the least explored places on Earth, except perhaps, the Antarctic, which is maybe that's debatable. But even there's even some really interesting legends going back, and this would be to like the Western or the Midwestern Native Americans who had legends. And I know this is sort of getting off into bizarro land, but all ancient cultures have legends of them having essentially acquired their knowledge from either serpent brothers or some type of serpent or some type of beings that descended from the heavens or something along those lines. And it usually has to deal with serpents. In the ancient Chinese, it was dragons. In the ancient Hopi or in the Midwestern Indian tribes that specifically had this legend, they said that there was some worldwide catastrophe that caused their lizard brothers to basically dig a city and a bunch of caverns and huge, I guess you could say, just huge rooms and caverns, just basically a city underneath the ground, which happens to lie directly underneath Los Angeles. Now, there's a scientist, I wish I knew his name off the top of my head, but you can research him. He was, I believe he was the guy that invented the, I want to say, the radio spectrometer. It's the device that you essentially roll across the ground and you can get a radar, or maybe it's a sonar reading that bounces back, you know, many meters down, and it can basically, through, I guess it would be sonic waves, give you an image of what's beneath you and how deep it is, and even what the composites are, like gold and this and that. And he found that these ancient legends corresponded with this, I think he wanted to say at least 100-meter deep city that was laid out in the shape of a lizard, basically oriented north to, going from southwest up to northwest, with the tail of the lizard being in the southwest and the head of the lizard being in the northeast. And so that's basically right under Los Angeles. And so, yeah, Hollow Earth, I think there's definitely something to that. You know, there very well could be vast amounts of subterranean stuff that we have absolutely no clue is there. So, yeah, there's all sorts of possibility underground.
And John, you know, like dragons are always said to live in caves, right? So there's a connection there.
Right, there you go, yeah.
Can I make a comment about the Cold War?
Sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we're talking about the Apollo missions, and that, you know, we were trying to, you know, this race to space to prove that we were the stronger of the two. Now, if you go by the theory, and I'm pretty sure John believes that really that Russia and the United States really aren't these big enemies, that, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but that they're really kind of actually colluding, that they don't dislike each other as much as they would like everybody to believe. But if you go by the theory that there was a Cold War and we had the race to space, if you look at it from a dollar perspective, the reason the United States won the Cold War was because of the petrodollar, and that after we went off the gold standard, the United States, any barrel of oil that was purchased from OPEC nations had to be purchased in dollars. And that instantly, with us being the world reserve currency, and then dollar or oil having to be purchased in dollars, made the United States the richest nation in the history of the world. We basically outspent Russia. We basically bankrupted them over the Cold War. They couldn't continue to produce arms at the rate that the United States could, and they went bankrupt. So if you prescribe to the theory that there was a Cold War, that's actually the reason why we won it. No other reason.
Yeah, and you know, the petrodollar, there's so much to that too, and I'm glad that you did sort of jump back to the Cold War and the sort of Russian-American dichotomy, and a lot of this really goes back to the origins of NASA, which was definitely rife with Nazis. I mean, it is a fact. They used Operation Paperclip to sort of smuggle Nazi scientists over, and that was the origins of NASA. But all of this was sort of all coming together during, you know, after World War II, sort of coalescing into the Cold War. And, you know, I totally agree with you that, yeah, Russia and America have been very staunch allies since World War II, through World War II, and I believe ever since. But what the United States and Russia realized, and this is a very common tactic of these elitists, is to you have to have this sort of Hegelian dialectic, this false dichotomy. You know, go back to George Orwell's 1984, and it sort of spells it out for you that they're playing us against each other. It's an excuse to build up arms, and it's an excuse for standing armies. It's an excuse for fear porting us into, you know, I mean, you remember the old reels of the children, you know, getting under their desks and putting their head between their knees so that they might, you know, be saved from an atomic blast, which atom bombs probably don't exist. But yeah, it was all very much used to the benefit of propaganda. And I think that what NASA gleaned from the Nazi or the German engineers, which everybody knows German engineering is pretty damn good. I'm not knocking their engineering, but what the Germans, and especially a lot of the NASA originators, were specialists in was not just rocket science, but also propaganda and essentially mass mind control, because that's exactly what propaganda is. It's essentially swaying people's opinions towards a way that you want them to believe, and it's done incrementally, it's done over time, it's done through repetition, but it's extremely effective, especially if you can control everything over a period of at least 3 generations. And we're well into that. And so, yeah, Russia and the United States, they sure do a lot of screaming and shouting, like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant prior to a fake wrestling match. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure that they go and have a beer after the show, and that's probably a similar analogy with Russia and the United States, I would imagine.
One other thing about the Apollo missions, and I find interesting, and you brought up Neil deGrasse Tyson. So Kristen said that we went to back to the moon, and I believe she said 71 to get the picture of Earth that we didn't get the first time, right? So that picture of Earth, as you described it, is the blue marble. How can Neil deGrasse Tyson now come out and say, when they've been showing us a picture of a perfect sphere, a marble, a big basketball, however you want to describe the ball, and then tell us now, well, it's not really a ball, it's pear-shaped, and that's why, and I believe they're doing this to basically throw people off of the curvature, that it's really not a perfect sphere. So the reason why people can't pick up curvature, or curvature isn't measurable the way you would think it is because it's really shaped like a pear.
One thing about that, though, is it's sort of misleading because of the way Tyson presented that data. For all intents and purposes, you could, according to the heliocentric model, essentially call the world perfectly spherical, but based on their theory and based on some observations, I think it has to do with the pendulum experiments and other things. But you're right, it is to throw us off. But the difference is so minute in the grand scheme of things. I want to say that the average, like in the north, is something along the lines of like it's like the scale of Mount Everest taller than that of the south, or something like that. But in terms of Mount Everest, that's essentially, you know, a millimeter in the grand scheme of things of the Earth itself. And so it was a little bit disingenuous of him, because even as the way he described it, I mean, we're certainly not seeing any sort of equatorial bulge on the sun or the moon or any of the planets, and so that sort of throws that theory right out the window. But at the same time, you know, all of that, it wouldn't, to me, I don't think it would be measurable. Although from certain angles, you know, in space, if the Earth was shaped as he is saying, an oblate spheroid pronounced at the poles, that it would be evident. But you know, that guy's full of crap anyway, so whatever.
Wouldn't it have to be a perfect sphere in order for you not to feel wobble as it spun at 1,000 miles an hour? I mean, if it was shaped that way, or it wasn't perfect, wouldn't you think that there would be some type of again, wobble to it? I mean, if you take a ball and you put, you know, an object on the one side of it and you start to spin it, I mean, it won't spin. It won't spin correct. I mean, you know, it won't spin perfectly.
Right. Yeah. Like if you were to take, say, like a flywheel, like a gyroscope, and like stick something off the edge, yeah, it's not gonna. Right. I totally get what you're saying. Real quick, and I know, Fran, you had a presentation that you were prepping for, so I don't know how ready you are, but just real quick, bouncing back to the petrodollar, because it is something that you mentioned, and I wanted to make a point on. It really is a tragedy that all of this, you know, infrastructure and the whole idea of a petrodollar and all of this work that's been done into basically scamming us into buying fuel from the Rothschilds, but even all of that is essentially, that's public property, it's public wealth, it's public good. It was all taxpayer funded. Whether or not you say it was Rothschild funded with private investments, that's bull crap. They were in collusion with the government. And the point that I have is, if you look at the Kuwaitis, I believe, or maybe it's this Saudi American Emirates or whatever, but there's certain countries over there in the Middle East that consider their oil wealth as a national property, as a national good. And so I believe I'm correct that it's the Kuwaiti citizens are the richest people in the world because they have an actual representative government that sort of spreads the wealth of their nation evenly across to the people. Which is totally not done here at all. It all goes to the corporations, which are a bottomless pit for cash, and they send their money overseas in order to do all sorts of corporate espionage and financial assassination. But I think if we were to use that Kuwaiti model, whereas, and call me a socialist, I don't think this is socialist, but I think that taxpayer-funded, taxpayer-invested ventures, and especially schemes like the Petro-dollar, should benefit the people, but instead they've sort of funneled it and siphoned it through, interlocking schemes that bypasses us and basically rapes us, robs us from within, and is essentially destroying our economy through bubbles and bursts like the housing crisis and the Great Depressions. But I think more and more people getting wise to this sort of thing is at least going to help, because we'll have more people aware, more people to help solve the problems. So anyway, unless there's any final thoughts on that, Fran, were you ready, or did you still need some more time? Or
well, I'm actually gonna have to get going soon, so I need to get my kids ready for bed and everything.
Okay, did you want to run through it real quick, or come back because
maybe, but well, because it's kind of a lot. I guess and I started thinking about it, and maybe I just need to just save it for my video anyway, because I usually don't get in front of the camera. I usually just do the whole PowerPoint thing and everything, but I think I might have to get in front of the camera for this next one. But I guess I could pull up, there's this one thing I wanted to show you guys.
Yeah, if you could maybe like touch on the highlight, because my curiosity is definitely piqued. So
all right, just real quick, I'm gonna do a screen share.
like a teaser or video or whatever, because I know you got to get the youngsters to bed, and I don't want to interfere with that. But it's sort of like, oh God, now you have to show me a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
All
okay,
right.
so let me screen share. Hold on.
All right, I presented you to everyone, so you should be able to screen share at your leisure.
Is it showing? I don't know if it's showing yet.
I see it.
Yeah, it's showing on my end, and I'll check the live feed and just make sure that there's about a 20 or 30-second delay, but I'll make sure that it pops up on the live feed as well.
Oh, it looks like it's there. Okay.
Okay.
So, on my last video, Mirror Mirror, which on my new video that I'm doing, because I'm doing more research into this topic has still got me very intrigued, and I'm still finding parallels and connections, and this rabbit hole is going so crazy deep. But one of the comments I'd gotten on that video was somebody said, "Oh, there's lots of pictures of Antarctica." I don't even think they looked at my video. They saw that it was a flat Earth related video and spammed it, and they sent me this link with Antarctic pictures. And I found this one I have on the screen very interesting. It's the Superior Mirage. The whole Chicago skyline is supposed to be a Superior Mirage, but it wasn't inverted. Well, this is interesting. On my second video, the Flat Earth Food for Thought, I did an experiment with hot boiling water and ice cubes on the outside and ice cubes in the middle. And I was able to keep the water just flowing just from the heat and the cold mixture.
Yeah, I saw that.
And I'm thinking about doing some more experiments with heat and cold, because we're getting this mirage here because the air is warm and the ground is cold. And I think that perhaps this interplay, this whole, and there's a Bible verse, and I can't remember, I would have to look it up for the video, I'd have to look it up. There's a Bible verse that goes perfectly with this. But I think that the idea of hot and cold, needs to be experimented with more a little bit when it comes to the flat Earth model, because I still think that there's a lot of dynamics. You know, a lot of the dynamics that we've talked about before are the electromagnetic dynamics. We've talked about those. We've talked about, you know, some of the topography type dynamics. We've talked about some of that. We talked about frequencies. You know, we talked about some of that. But one of the things we haven't talked a whole lot about is the hot and cold. And I think that the extremes, you know, and you guys kind of talked earlier a little bit about how the southern and northern regions should be boiling, right?
Yeah, right.
Right, and I agree. And I think that the way that the hot and cold work here is actually obviously not how they say, but is needs to be explored more, because I think that has something to do with a lot of the ocean currents and so forth that we see, and that it has more to do that this dynamic between hot and cold have more to do with how things work than we're giving credit for, is what I'm trying to say. You know, because Earth has a lot of heat beneath it as well, but then there's also so much cold, you know, on Earth as well. And I think that those dynamics are causing a lot of the things that we see.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And even in terms of like the sun and the moon, I think that there's a big dynamic going on that affects, I mean, obviously all sorts of things. Like, and just like you said, there's this inherent relationship between temperature, pressure, and density. And the three of these variables sort of go hand in hand. I mean, it's almost like two sides of a coin, or three sides of a three-sided dice. I don't know, but no, you're right. And I think that like the entire definition of temperature, you know, as far as I'm taught, maybe you can correct me on this, but as far as I remember in science class and in physics, that temperature is sort of an average measurement of theoretically what are little atoms sort of excited and bouncing off of each other, and essentially we experience that average excitement as warmth. But then when you get into areas like the thermosphere, where there aren't hardly any atoms, and yet they say these temperatures get up to extreme heats, then it, you know, and I've said this before, then okay, then must we redefine temperature? And then, you know, you get into different densities of plasma and how that affects temperature. But
Right.
maybe I'm going off onto a tangent here, but I think you're definitely onto something, because in terms of a grand unified theory, I could see electromagnetism, density, temperature, all of this sort of being, you know, just all different sides of the same force, if you will. And maybe that's a little naive and oversimplified, but.
Well, you know, yeah, I think that what you're talking about, as far as the, you know, the atoms in the atmosphere and how they're supposed to have these extreme temperatures as well. I also agree that there probably is some extreme temperatures going on, you know, up there, okay? But that's why I think that we need to look at this a little bit more, because I think it's just a part of how things work, because you know, the way that the heat transfers, it goes from the hot thing to the cold thing, and I think that, I don't know, I'm sorry, I wasn't really prepared. This is just kind of something I've just started looking into, but I do plan on doing some more experiments, and maybe seeing if I could, you know, duplicate a dual direction water flow. The only thing is, the pan that I used on my last experiment was, you know, the biggest I could get with, so I'd have to buy like more pans, and oh, I'm sorry about that. I'd have to buy more pans and things to make it work, but I think it would be really interesting and could really be worth it.
Do you want to know what my suggestion would be if you wanted to try to achieve naturally the sort of opposing rotations, like in the center vortex versus the outside, would be to somehow apply a dipole magnet underneath it. Because if you get a magnet underneath it, it's going to produce a magnetic vortex, which, by its nature, say it's the vortex is rotating counterclockwise in the center of the magnet. It's actually rotating in the opposite direction on the outside of the magnet, so it would be rotating clockwise. And I'm just wondering, maybe you could do some control, with or without that type of magnetic force beneath it or somehow within the experiment, and just see if you get any sort of different results. Because I really loved what you did. Essentially, the experiment that you did is you had, I guess it was ice in the center of a dish, ice around the outside of a dish with, what was it, warm water and some red dye in the center, or?
Yeah, I had the plate. The plate was neutral, but it was on top of a pan that was actually on a warm stove, and then I put boiling water inside of the pan, and then I added the dye to the water so that we could better see the movement of the water. And I didn't do a control, and so that was a flaw with that. And then the other thing I didn't do was somebody had mentioned that because it was spinning clockwise, they made a comment about that, and that it was because I was in the northern hemisphere. And I just thought that was stupid, because you can tell that the way I was pouring it was kind of setting it in motion to go that way. So so I was thinking what I needed to do is I needed to do it again and accentuate the pouring to go in as center as I can, and then like clockwise and counterclockwise as well. Try to do both and see if it'll do it equally in both directions. And then also, like you said, John, that was a really good tip. I really appreciate that. That was a good idea with the magnet. I'm gonna go ahead and try that as well with the magnet, because I am trying to kind of duplicate the flow of the water going in dual directions.
Well, and none of it's conjecture either, because I mean it's common scientific. I mean it's pretty well known that the Earth generates an electromagnetic field. All compasses point towards the north, and if you really think about it logically, that would imply a magnetic vortex towards the north. If you're looking at an AE projection, that would be the center. And so, first of all, dipole magnets ain't cheap, but you can get one, relatively small size for, not too expensive. But I would recommend just, if you're not familiar with it, just maybe research a little bit. You can probably get one cheaper, but I think that might help. And again, it's not anything that we're just adding in for conjecture. It's that an electromagnetic vortex appears to really actually be part of this natural world, and so maybe that will, it may not affect it at all, or maybe it'll have some effect on the experiment.
Yeah, and that's what's so great about it, and that's what's so exciting about it, is that's what we're going to see, and it's, and that's what's going to be fun and exciting, and that's why I want to do it, because I want to see what's going to happen. So in order to get a good magnet, though, I think I'm going to have to, call some favors or something.
Yeah.
Call some people.
But isn't it fun though? Because personally, I always used to love science class. I didn't really like dissecting the frog, but I did it. But it was sort of the pop culture, I don't know, growing up for me at least, that school was stupid, and anybody that liked school was stupid, and so you sort of had to keep it under wraps. But there were certain classes that I really enjoyed: physics, science. I even sort of liked math. I mean, I kind of enjoyed school altogether, but I really liked the sciences, just because it's like, okay, here's a theory. Let's test it. Let's see if it's viable, and let's expand from there. And it's just such a inherently honest and reliable process, which is why I think it's so vicious what sort of theoretical physics has done to the science at large, is take just totally undemonstrable, unfalsifiable theories about the lights in the sky and basically stamp that onto our cultural belief system as fact, when us little flat earthers here doing the best we can with real experiments are showing, you know, far more interesting results than astronomy, as far as I'm concerned, will ever yield. So there you have it.
Guys, I should probably get going. John, thank you so much for having me on the show today, and I'm really glad that I was able to come on a Wednesday, since Wednesdays usually aren't very good for me. And it was really nice talking with you, Jason and Kristen.
Yeah, it was awesome having you.
Friend.
Thank you so much for coming. You better get those youngins together. And for anybody out there that doesn't know, go subscribe to Fran Anderson on YouTube. She's got some awesome stuff. Obviously, she's got some more stuff in the works to look forward to. And we'll see you here and there on the show whenever you can make it. It was really a pleasure having you, Franny.
Hey, Fran.
Yes.
Real quickly, I wanted to say to you that I listened to the show on Saturday, probably about a month ago, and you said one of the things that I think was probably one of the more intelligent things that I've heard, which was, and John said this last week, he kind of stole it from you, which was people assume that because when we look up in space and you see a planet or you see the moon or the sun, that it appears to be a sphere, that we're spheres. And if you were a mushroom in the forest and you looked at a bunch of trees, you weren't able to see yourself. You were to assume that you're a tree. And I thought that was a very astute, intelligent comment, and a really good thing to say to somebody that just says, well, we have to be a planet because look at all the other planets out there. We have to be a sphere, you know. I thought that was a really astute comment.
My analogy was awful. The analogy I used was if you throw if you throw bread into the water, ducks come and eat it. And then if you eat a piece of the bread, therefore you're a duck.
Okay, starting to sound like Quest for the Holy Grail logic over here.
Right. Fran, hey girl, thank you so much, and as always, I'll send you an invite to the shows, and the ones you can make, and as obviously, I mean, I don't expect anyone to stick through 3 or 4 hours if you can't, so as always, it really was a pleasure, and we'll look forward to talking to you again real soon.
All right, I look forward to it again. Bye, everybody.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay, so now that Fran's gone, oh God, let's talk about Fran. No, I'm kidding. No, I love Fran. I was only kidding. So we are 1 down, but we are still 3 strong, and we still got plenty to talk about. We've got another hour and a half, or an hour and 20 minutes. If you guys so choose to participate, that's up to you. I think we were definitely getting into some interesting conversation in terms of the Cold War, the petrodollar, the international dateline is something that we hadn't talked about, and I don't know, Kristen, if you wanted to mention that yet, or do you want to go to something else, or?
Well, how do you guys feel about it right now? Does it feel like it's time to talk about it for the 2 of you, or should we wait a while?
Well, it's something that you know, we've kicked around a bit on the show. I don't know if Jason's been in a part of that, but I'm certainly not as well versed in this aspect of it as you. Now, one thing I'll say is I've never been to the International Dateline, and I don't know anyone personally who's ever been to the National Dateline, but there appears to be some very strange things afoot in and around the International Dateline, and I don't want to misquote one of the videos that you linked me to, Kristen, but there was one video that sort of stuck out with me, that there are 2 islands, and unless you want to tell the little anecdote, the 2 islands that are...
They're 90 miles apart, from what I understand, and I can't remember the name of them, John. They're tricky, right? It's like, I'm going to say it wrong.
They're very short names. They're like Fuji and Tahoe, but those are totally not it, but it's something like that. But they're the only 2 islands that are 90 miles apart. One is on the east side of the International Dateline, and one is on the west side of the International Dateline. So they're pretty close islands. 90 miles is not that far. And yeah, for the life of me, I can't remember the name, but I'll try to look it up as you described.
Darn it, I can't remember the channel name either, so whatever, look, you know, real help I am right now, but this is...
You're fired.
It's like Pago, I should be, thank you.
Yeah, no, that was one. Pago was one, you're right, absolutely right, yep.
something else that is just not popping in. So anyway, it's okay. They're 90 miles apart, but his point in the video is that his theory is that they're actually thousands of miles apart, and then he tells you he's going to say the actual miles of the flight, but then he never really does. I listened to it a couple of times, and it's really kind of confusing. But in essence, his theory may be true that they're actually thousands of miles apart, but that's a big conversation. So it. But I do want to have, pardon me, a little bit of a conversation about the dateline, or at least ask a question about it, which is the key question as I see it, and what I've been distilling it down to, which is the question of how does it possibly make sense on a sphere or on a circular flat Earth layout that there would be a 24-hour time jump, which is what happens when you cross the date line. In case anyone listening didn't know that already, but it's a complete 24-hour time jump. And myself, I didn't really fully know that. I mean, I'd heard a couple people talk about flying back and forth. I have a close friend who goes to Australia a couple, times, over the year for work, and so just really, he's losing a day and gaining a day, and so he's used to that. And anybody that does that type of flying has experienced it. But so many of us have never done that kind of flying, and have never maybe really heard that it's an actual whole day, an entire 24 hours that has to necessarily move forwards or backwards, depending upon which direction you're going, of course. And so how does that work on a sphere or on a circular flat Earth map layout? Because understand, you've seen people make these, clocks out of the flat Earth map, right? Where it's a clock, like for your wall, right? And some,
Right,
I
it'd be
don't,
like a 24-hour clock.
and I think some people are just doing a 12-hour version, but yes, I believe there are some 24-hour versions, and as more accurately they should be, and that's the way it would have to work. Let me just put it simply.
The other island, I believe, is Apia, by the way.
There you go. You did it. Thank
Yep.
you, John.
All right, go ahead. Sorry.
And so, no worries, and thank you for looking that up. That's great. And so, it would have to work like the clock. The circular flat Earth layout would have to necessarily, and let me say it a different way, where every time we pass over one time zone to the next, and they're roughly 1,000 miles each, and there's 24 time zones, and we have a 24-hour day, which is how long it takes for the sun to go around through all the time zones, right? That means the sun is going 1,000 miles per hour roughly, interestingly enough, which some people I think touch on here or there, but I don't hear that too much. I was just thinking about it one day and saying to myself, that's funny how the sun goes 1,000 miles an hour, huh?
Well, yeah, and another thing interesting, not to interrupt, but Brian recently mentioned this, and I can't believe I had missed this. Maybe people had Oh, it looks like I've been muted this whole time. Wow. So I was talking to dead air. Sorry about that, all y'all out there. I had muted myself. We lost Kristen and Jason. Do we have you, boss man?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, yeah, no, I was totally like, hey, talking, and I had myself muted. So essentially, what I was trying to do while we had that awkward silence was I was trying to find this particular video where this gentleman is sort of explaining his experiences flying between these two islands, or maybe it was his research in terms of flying between these two islands. But essentially, again, it's Pago Pago and Apia are the two islands. They're 90 degrees apart, opposite ends of the international date line. And, and I'm sorry that we had lost Kristen because she's sort of been looking into this a lot more detail than I have. But I've mentioned on this show before, there are some curiosities with the international date line as well as equatorial sundials, which have led some to start looking down alternative models as opposed to the AE matrix, the azimuthal equidistant matrix. And I think that that's perfectly legitimate because, that's what science is. Now, there are a lot of good proofs and a lot of good evidence that the North is in the center and that the heavenly bodies are essentially making circuits above and around the, concentric with the North Pole or the North Pole star. There is good evidence for that. But there are some inconsistencies that people are having trouble, sort of explaining in a flat Earth model. Again, one of those would be equatorial sundials, which, if you're not familiar, you have to have a specific special kind of sundial at the equator because that's the only way that it'll tell time. You'll have to do a little bit of research into sundials and how they work and the difference between a typical sundial and an equatorial sundial. But there is a sort of anomaly there that apparently, according to some, doesn't work in a flat Earth model where the sun is making a circuit. And then, of course, you've got this other sort of inconsistency, at least with the heliocentric model, with the international date line. Again, the international date line is sort of the now one may call it arbitrary because I guess you could pick any point or any meridian line to call the international date line. But according to this theory, it's not arbitrary at all. There is actually something to this international date line beyond just being the arbitrary point where we decided to zero out the clock, if you will. And this sort of account of the flights between Pago Pago and Apia supports this theory. Now, there's different models being kicked around. Some call it the Pac-Man model, which, I think doesn't really do it justice. I would call it a linear model. I don't necessarily subscribe to it. I still subscribe more towards a typical flat Earth model with the north in the center and the south being on the outside. However, with that being said, there are lots of problems with the AE projection. It's defined in the very sort of map that it is, just like the problems with the Mercator projection are defined in the sort of map that it is. And so we really can't take, globe earthers or flat earthers, we can't take these inconsistencies in the matrices of the maps that we use in order to plot out, latitude and longitude estimations because they're known inconsistencies. And, I guess our audience here probably understands the differences, but just to briefly describe the differences and inconsistencies between the maps, the AE map or the azimuthal equidistant map, which is what most people consider the flat Earth map, is it's a azimuthal equidistant matrix, and so
Kristen's back, John.
We got you back, awesome. But essentially, just to finish the point, the AE matrix is basically correct in terms of relative sizes and distances between continents, right at the center. And you can arbitrarily put that center anywhere. But typically, in the flat Earth model, that center is at the North Pole, and logically so because the North Pole star Polaris always remains directly above that point. So it is sort of logical to use that as a center. However, the problem with the AE map is the further south or away from the center you get, the less and less accurate it becomes in terms of relative sizes and distances up to the point of infinity at the periphery of the map. So that's that's not a very reliable map, agreed, but the very same thing can be said about the Mercator projection, because it is a cylindrical conformal map, which simply means is mostly correct towards the equator, less and less and less correct as you get away from the equator to the poles, where a single point is stretched to infinity. So we literally have the exact same inconsistencies and issues with the AE map as we do with the Mercator projection. And so while neither one of them are accurate representations of the face of the Earth, they can both be used to adequately either navigate or track weather patterns and that sort of thing. But since we got you back, Kristen, I just sort of was filling in the blanks, giving a little bit of background into the Appia and Poga Poga, the international dateline, the differences between the Mercator projection and the AE map. And so if you want to just sort of pop back in, I guess you had some technical difficulties.
I did. Yeah, they don't like it when I talk about the international dateline. I don't know. That's too funny. Whoever they are, and if there is a they don't like it when I talk about that. So
they live.
It's one of those things,
I came to kick ass and chew bubble gum, and I'm all out of bubble gum.
Oh no.
I'm kidding.
Now it's all ass kicking, I guess, eh? So, yeah, I had to give up bubble gum when I was 12. I had already overdone it by then.
Oh, well, it's full of aspartame, so everybody stay away from bubble gum. Aspartame, they found a shortcut, and the same thing as NutraSweet, I believe. The shortcut way to make it is to feed a genetically modified brand of E. coli bacteria, a specific source of glucose or sugars, I believe, and this genetically modified E. coli bacteria excretes aspartame. So that's what you're drinking in a Diet Coke or even in sugar-free gum. So anyway, just thought I'd bring that in there.
That was an excellent, yes, add-in topic. But it was good. It was like a public service announcement.
Public service announcement. Don't chew bubble gum, but you can still kick ass.
That's great. So yeah, where were we? Oh my goodness. Okay, so everything froze. It said that Jason muted me, which I don't believe really happened, by the way, Jason. And then everything, I couldn't hear you guys anymore. And
yeah,
I
totally got muted too. I'm not sure how that happened.
No, I think I might have muted you guys. I don't.
No, I don't think you can though. Like somebody totally muted us all and booted Kristen.
That's really weird. Yeah, they made it look like Jason did it.
It was Fran Anderson getting her revenge. No, I'm kidding.
That's it. It was Fran. Oh my gosh. Okay, something has to explain it, right?
Yeah, we'll just blame it on Fran. We'll just blame it on Fran because she's gone.
Oh my gosh. So, okay, the international dateline. Where I left off was the idea that it would, for the circular layout as well as for the sphere alike, this is one problem they both have in common. That for this this passage of the dateline to make sense, it would have to be just like any other passage of between any other two time zones. When that line between any two time zones is crossed, it needs to be an equal increment of time, and to correspond with the distance being an equal unit, right? And that's, I hope what I'm saying is basic enough that it makes sense. So just like a clock, going back to that simple way of saying it, and that every movement is an equal unit, an equal increment. Distance and time have that relationship when we're moving on the 3D plane as we know it, where we expect a certain miles per hour, right? A certain time is passed, unit of time is passed, and per so many miles and so on, right? So this is the way. Nothing can explain. There's two things that happen at the international dateline. There's two things that happen. One is, it is where the new day begins being counted from. So 12 a.m., which in the northern hemisphere is, dark, obviously. But this is where the new day begins, right? And so now it's a new date. We've crossed from whatever today's date is to tomorrow's date at 12 a.m., right? That's the first thing that happens. But the other thing that happens is what my question revolves around. Because it's totally fine and good that's where the day starts. And that, by the way, is if we're looking at a Mercator map, the map that we all grew up looking at, and I know I came in at the tail end to be talking a little bit about the Mercator map, which I caught that, and that was fine. But we're talking about the farthest west point. Am I saying that wrong? Oh my gosh, I think I'm saying that wrong. Oh no, don't even. I shouldn't have even brought it up because I totally switched that around when I try to. It's not something I've talked about before, and so I realized if I'm going to talk about that, I better.
Well, we can
not.
pull up a map just to sort of give an idea, because a lot of people aren't familiar with the international dateline. So if you want, I can either present to you or I can screen share and just sort of pull up a map.
Okay, we could do that. And so, yeah, most Mercator maps show the tip of the far east of, which is Russia, the far east part of Russia, cut off, and they'll show it on the far west side of the map. So they show the international dateline not quite perfectly dividing entirely the east and the west side of the maps. And then we also have an understanding when we look at the Mercator map that there's an east side and a west side. We're told that, and yet in a spherical reality, there wouldn't be an east side and a west side, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, technically, the way that they divide up the east and the west, obviously, is by the prime meridian. But yeah, it's all arbitrary. I mean, it's all based on the supposed axis of rotation being the top and the bottom or whatever. That axis runs through the top and bottom, and then of course, if that's the top and bottom, then they just arbitrarily decide the prime meridian as being one side of that is west and one side of that is east. But yeah, it's arbitrary. Agreed.
Which makes the international dateline the 180-degree line from that 0-point prime meridian that is the other flip side of this east-west division. So it's really a fascinating thing. But I can't say I totally agree on the idea that it's arbitrary, and that the international dateline I'm proposing might be anything but arbitrary. But we don't know for sure yet, and that's where if nobody can answer the time jump, we have a real problem. For me, it is a clear debunker for not only the sphere, but also the circular AE map, or the circular flat Earth model, one and the same. And so and then that's a bigger conversation, which gets into how much can we trust the data of timeanddate.com about relative altitudes as far as hours of sun per day being the same at equal distances from the equator, north to south, about the path of the sun being straight versus circular, because of there is a lack of very conclusive evidence about the path of the sun being circular. It might be somewhat arcing, but actually circling, that's something we haven't totally nailed down. And I know that's a bigger conversation too, about all the different reasons why the AE map or the circular, again, flat Earth model layout is still a little bit subject to investigation and scrutiny and argument, debate, whatever.
I think we're way off. I really think that we need to sort of look at all sorts of different models and options. And I've said this before, not to interrupt, but one of the big things that sort of struck me when I started looking into this is that you only have 90 degrees north and 90 degrees south. And of course, you have 180 degrees west and 180 degrees east. And so to me, I understand the logic, the so-called logic behind it, but that's sort of a problem in a spherical sense to me. But then when you look at something like the AE map, you've basically got what are essentially the same continents, just, instead of wrapped around a ball, they're wrapped around a central point. And it's got problems with it. I just mentioned and I described, and the problems with the AE projection. But
yes.
Beyond that, though, beyond those issues, and I do have it up on screen. Hopefully, you guys can see the international dateline very conveniently separates, the eastern side of Russia with the far western side of Alaska, and sort of down in here. This is where one of these areas where you've got Pago Pago and Apia on opposite sides of this date line. And again, I tried and tried to find that guy that did the little brief documentary on it, and I can't find it for the life of me. But maybe we'll find it, or maybe somebody will find it and post a link. But it was interesting if his claims were true. But one of my big problems is, and I'll let you continue, I promise, but I've just personally never been to the international dateline, and what I guess what I'm thinking is let's say you had an airplane that could fly 5,000 miles an hour. So if you go west, let's say you start in Alaska and it's Monday. If you go west, it's immediately going to become Tuesday, right?
Right.
Okay. And then if you say go 5,000 miles an hour really, really fast west and go all the way back around, whether it's a globe or whether you're circumnavigating the magnetic north, whatever, you head due west and you go past Alaska again. And let's say this happened, I don't want to do the math, but it's going to happen in less than a day. It happened in maybe, 5 hours or something like that? I don't know. So about 5 hours. So
Right.
is what you're saying is now going to be Wednesday?
Well,
Will you cross that again?
we would this. Okay. Oh shoot! I lost track of the days, and now I'm not sure I'm going to answer that.
I'm not trying to throw you off. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand what your sort of not theory, but what you're trying to convey, because it is a little bit confusing.
Yes.
Even to me, and I've gone over it a few times. So.
Right. If we could, I think we're in agreement that if we could, like the example with the two brothers, that there's no real time travel happening. I'm not proposing time travel is happening. What is happening is something that here's the thing is we have to add or subtract 24 hours when we cross that line, because it's simply necessary to fit back into the matrix of the current day. In the rest of the time zones. That's all that it's for. Because the actual 24 hours didn't literally pass. It just, we necessarily have to add or subtract a day to fit back into the current day that's happening. So even if we could go around the sphere super fast, like you're saying, more times than once in 24 hours, we're not going to keep losing another day each successive time we cross the date line. Time travel's never been proven, for one thing, but all that would keep happening is we would just keep re-entering the matrix of the current day. It's just that when you cross it once, I mean, you've got to necessarily just jump back to fit into whatever the current day is. Once again, I can't say it really any other way than that.
Well, and I've heard tales of savvy stock traders or market players or whatever using this to their advantage because technically, in Alaska, say it's Monday, and in Russia it's Tuesday. Then if you live in Alaska or even in California, then you're sort of a day ahead of the competition. And so to me, it's sort of funny, and I haven't researched it enough. I am interested to know when the international dateline was implemented and accepted and drawn out the way that we accept it today. But I do think that it's interesting that it divides Russia and America as opposite sides of this whole day and night thing, when in fact, you could take what's her face, the vice presidential cast, Sarah Palin. She said that she'd be a good ambassador because she could see Russia from her house in Alaska, which I'm not sure how that qualifies her for anything, but they sort of laughed her off the stage, but it's true. I mean, the eastern portion, that peninsula, jutting off of the far east side of the, I guess you'd say Eurasia, is very, very close.
Peninsula.
Yeah, there you go.
It's 55 miles or so, roughly. It's the Bering Strait, I believe, that goes through there. Or am I totally off base there?
It's the Bering Strait.
Yeah.
So I want to know if her statement is literally true or if it was just sort of, a figure of speech kind of a thing. I would like some confirmation on that.
I think she meant it as if it was relative, and maybe, realistic, like actually, but maybe she was just speaking sort of, in an analogy.
Right, that's my question. So then a couple of things I can mention about the dateline from what I've researched so far is somebody actually found on timeanddate.com an article there about, I guess, during the time of Morgellon, is it? Traveling the seas and just
Magellan.
going.
Magellan, yeah.
Morgellon. Oh, I'm confusing it with that terrible.
John, you been sailing the seas, buddy?
So sorry. So
Yeah, and
sorry.
no, it's awful because my username, the Morgile, I've used it for probably 2 decades, just from a gamer's, not even a game designer standpoint, but just from an online gamer standpoint. And then of course now it has all these negative connotations with Magellan, Morgellons, and let's not forget, Morgile, as if I'm trying to beguile people. All sorts of different,
Oh, that's too funny.
yeah, dissertations into my name, and of course it was just something that I randomly picked. Well, not randomly, it was just original, and it worked for a gamer standpoint. So anyway,
So the guy.
Magellan.
Thank you, Magellan. I was gonna say it right, thank goodness, but I still was too afraid to mess it up again. Okay. Yeah, it's been a long day. I already knew that, but that was too funny. Feeling really old right now. Hilarious. So So this guy was sailing, and so they would go. They'd be going island to island, whatever, across large expanses of the Pacific and whatnot. Right? That's the hugest area there. That's where you're going to cross the date line. Obviously, that's where we're talking about, this large expanse of the Pacific Ocean, which gets as far away from the land masses as you can, other than that, those tips of America and Russia there. And so they would chart, how many miles they'd traveled, right? But apparently they got to a certain island where then they checked in with the locals, and it was the next day, and they didn't expect it to be the next day from how many miles they'd traveled. And so it was as if they'd kind of, this date line seems to have been kind of a phenomenon that had to be acknowledged rather than something that just they created because they decided they would for some reason, which again needs to be explained why this time jump has to happen. And the other thing that I can mention is the little jog around is explained when you look it up, from what I've seen so far, as certain countries and or states requesting that so that it's easier for them in terms of commerce, and also just everybody being on the same day because they're close together. And so it's very interesting in the example of the Apia and Pago Pago, or am I saying Pago Pago wrong now? Whatever.
Close
that
enough.
that they actually are going along with being in 2 separate days, even though they're only 90 miles apart. It's a really interesting thing. I don't know why.
So now let me just make sure I got this straight so far, because again, I really haven't researched into it much, and I think it is something that does need a second look, just like everything in science. But so as far as you can tell, or maybe we need to dig a little deeper, but it was actually Magellan who was in fact one of the first men to supposedly, or to be accredited with circumnavigating the Earth. So what you're saying is that he was the first person to sort of stumble across or acknowledge this sort of international date line?
I can't recall if it suggested he was the first person to, but he's an example of, I guess, historically, that people would recognize the name of him and so on, that was able to have an account, a record of that phenomenon. And there's, I'm sure, others like him. I can't, again, recall if it pointed to him as somebody who first stumbled onto that or not. I think the article is something to the effect of Tuesday. It has Tuesday and Thursday in the title, like it was Tuesday and now it's Thursday, something like this. But that doesn't even make sense. But it did have those 2 days of the week in the title, whatever the title is. And hopefully you can find it fairly easily.
Of that video that you had linked me prior. I could probably go back into my Facebook history and find it.
This is regarding the article if people want to look into it on the timeanddate.com.
And if you wanna send me a link to that in the private chat, I'll put it into the show notes so that I can link it up to the descripts.
I can do that, and I don't know if I can do it now without sort of crashing my computer.
Whenever. It doesn't have to be now, just whenever. We can do it after the show.
Okay, thank you. I might wait. I should wait to be safe.
Yeah, be safer than sorry. Yeah, sure.
So,
What's
because yeah,
interesting
sometimes.
about Appia and Pago Pago, as I'm looking at this globe, is they show them on the same side of the international dateline, which they show on this globe as Sunday, Monday. So on the east side of the international dateline, you have Sunday, and on the west side, you have Monday. But it shows them both on the Sunday side on this globe. And then when I look up Appia, it shows it on the west side, and I see this. It's talking about old international dateline, and then the new international dateline, as if like they've changed it, like they've shifted it. In this picture that I'm looking at on Google, and the old line, which would be representative of this globe, would have had Appia and Pago Pago on the east side, and now there's a new international dateline that has them separated, and I'm wondering when and why they've changed this international dateline.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, like Kristen said, the reason that they supposedly, like, it's this jagged, very nonsensical line that really doesn't make any sense on any model, but the reason that they say they've done this is because certain countries sort of requested to have it, like, I don't know, I guess you could say standardized in order to, you know, make commerce easy. But I mean, for one thing, that totally goes against splitting those two islands, which are 90 miles apart. But to me, it goes hand in hand with America just so happening to be a day ahead of Russia in this scheme, where we decide that, or not where we decide, or where this international dateline happens to be. But how could it possibly move? That's interesting, unless the globe was just being general and the new maps are being more accurate. Who knows?
The only thing that you could say is that but it would have had to tilted that way. I mean, if they're trying to say that the Earth is now more tilted on its axis, putting Appia further to the west, I don't know. You know, putting Appia on the Monday side. So if we go Monday, Sunday as the days, on the Monday side of the international
Which
data
would be
line.
on the left side or the west
Yes,
side.
and I'm looking at this. I'm looking at a picture.
Should
Here.
I? Do you want me to give you the let you screen share? Because I've just got a basic generic picture up. You want me to let you share screen?
Sure. Yeah. I don't know if would I just. That's fine. I don't know if I'll.
Or if you want to chat me over the link to what you're looking at, I can just pull it up since I'm already sharing.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll do that real quick.
Okay. And Kristen, if there's anything you wanted to add, because I know we sort of interjected. I know you were on to a couple of different points, but
Well, let me see. I definitely do want to. I had it in my mind a moment ago. Probably lost my train of thought. Sorry, but
I know we're terrible. I want to rename this show "Destroying People's Trains of Thought."
no. It happens for me very, very easily, and it's just one of these things where you guys were fine. What you were saying was great, and it wasn't like I felt cut in on, but I was thinking, God, I want to say this, and then it slips my mind because I didn't make a note of it. And apparently, yes, I'm getting older. Whatever. Okay, so the 24-hour time jump is the big problem, you see, because it needs to be explained. I want to know if not to put you on the spot, Jason, but if you have any comments or thoughts on this quandary of, again, I'm saying very clearly, this is a problem. It's an exact same problem whether we're talking about the sphere or the circular flat Earth layout. And does it make sense to you what I'm saying, that this 24-hour time jump doesn't work in either of those models for the same reason?
I guess I'd have to research it more and look into it, because the only reason it makes sense to me is that if you were on the Sunday side, that those hours have already disappeared. In other words, they're saying that the sun starts at that line on the one side, and when you cross over, that part of the day has already disappeared. So in other words, so Pago Pago is still Sunday on their side, and as 12 midnight strokes, you are on the other side. As 12 midnight strokes at Pago Pago, when you go to cross over that line, they're already how many hours advanced into the next day? I guess it just...
It is a 24-hour jump. I know it's confounding. It's something I'm just surprised. Kind of, I've stumbled onto this because I started to look into the possibility of the square flat Earth model, whether it would make any sense. And instead of delving into the model as presented by the guy who's presenting it, he's the only one really doing it, except for a couple other people who are actually presenting his model as well. I decided to make my own inquiry into it.
Now that would be, I know his name, but you can go ahead and plug his channel. What's his? I forget his name.
Sure, that's Free Energy. So
yeah, free energy. That's right. Yeah.
It's different where instead of free energy, it's free energy. So free with then ANERGY. So the only weird letter is the A, where you'd expect another E or something. But anyway.
Yeah. So instead of 3 E's, it's free energy. So
see, here's the thing about this international dateline is they could say the international dateline starts at, you know, basically I'll just pick Chicago, where the central time zone starts. They could say that's the international dateline, and that on the east side of that, which would be the Eastern time zone, that's Sunday, and to the west of that is Monday. I mean, they can pick anywhere on the globe, and that's how they can move it. Hold
on. Oh, sorry. Let me say, see, like, the thing is, again, well, let me put it this way. If the international dateline was arbitrary, if it could just be anywhere, then it wouldn't even need to exist at all. Let me just say that. And it may not make total sense right away when I just say that to you. But that's something I want you to mull over, and I hope you will look into this. I hope a lot of people will start to look into this, because it's a problem. And the issue is that if we can't sufficiently explain how a 24-hour time jump happens, because any 2 points you're talking about, all of them should only be an hour apart. Any two time zone line crossings, shouldn't matter where we're talking about. The international dateline should work exactly the same. The issue is that it doesn't. The interesting thing is that it does exactly divide east and west. It makes east and west two actual sides instead of arbitrary like they really would be if we were on a sphere. The other thing I need to throw out there to people to think about is that this is another... Let's say we are living on a square flat Earth instead of a circular flat Earth. This would explain why they had to tell us it was a sphere, among the other reasons that we've already come to uncover. This adds another big reason why they needed a sphere to explain how we circumnavigate, because if they reveal that there's something else going on with reality that we can't see that allows us to suddenly have to count off 24 hours even though they didn't literally pass, when it makes no sense at all, it would change our whole concept of reality as we know it, because there would have to be something else that we're not seeing to explain how this invisibly happens, this passage of... I call it a space jump because that's the only way you could explain it in essence, unless somebody can come up with something better, that a space jump has to be happening in order to explain the necessity of this time jump. And you see, the problem is they can tell you it's nothing, and the reason they can tell you it's nothing is because 24 hours isn't literally passing. But again, it does not make sense on a sphere or on a circle, because it's got to work like a clock. A literal clock. It has to work like a literal clock, where every movement of that second hand is an even increment of time and space. Time, distance, space, distance, in that example.
Okay, well, and good points all. I still, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm confused on it. I mean, I do
I
sort of
am.
see your arguments, and so there's some inconsistencies in it, and there's some things that lead me to believe that, maybe it's arbitrary or maybe there's something more to it. Now, one of the inconsistencies that I noticed early on, and I hate to always bring up this diagram of the Jeranism effect, but this is a good disproof of the heliocentric model. But we'll use this just as an example for what I would consider as the date line, and I can even apply this to a flat Earth model as well. But what I would consider as the date line would have to constantly be changing depending on the season. So let's just say we're using the heliocentric model, and let's say this line, I don't know if you guys can see me sort of tracing out this line on the axis, that would be sort of like the twilight zone, right, where you've got daytime on this side and nighttime on that side. To me, this twilight zone right here and wherever midnight corresponds to it should be the date line. I mean, whenever it turns midnight, then it's going to roll over to the next day, and that's going to be essentially stationary in the winter. But if you fast forward 6 months, then it would have phased all the way from this side being light to that side being dark. And so, as far as I can tell, then the date line technically should be constantly phasing around the Earth, depending on the time of season. That's especially in the heliocentric model. Now, if we apply it to a flat Earth model, the best thing I know to do is to pull up a 24-hour clock. And so let's just say, this right here is, we're just east of the international date line, and we travel, however many degrees west. You didn't actually travel, 22 hours. You just went beyond this arbitrary point. And so that's sort of the typical thought process and the typical argument against it. But then you have these weird, bizarre things like the whole Pago Appia thing, which I think needs further investigation. And you have the international date line being stationary, which sort of goes way against the heliocentric model like I just showed you. So there's some inconsistencies. I think it definitely needs more research, but at the same time, I also don't want to jump to conclusions. Now, I did watch one of Free Energy's videos, which sort of described how the stars worked in this sort of model, which to me, that's very nice and interesting and very brilliant. He's obviously very good at what he does, but as far as proof, I don't know, maybe demonstrating a principle, sure, but and again, Kristen, I'm not trying to be argumentative or put you on the spot, but this what I'm showing here on a flat Earth model is what most people are going to sort of jump right to and say, no, see, Kristen, you don't understand. I'm not telling you this, but this is what people are going to say. You don't understand. You didn't go 24 hours. You just went to tomorrow in 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, one day to the next happens in an hour. It doesn't require a sudden 24-hour time jump. That's the thing. It doesn't work on a circle. It doesn't work on a sphere. Somebody has to give me a better explanation because it doesn't make sense. And
what I was going to say too, like in the analogy I gave you, like let's say, okay, so you travel from here to here in an hour to it. Now it goes from Monday to Tuesday, right? Well, if you could zip around that hour hand at 5,000 miles an hour and then come across this line again, it's not going to be Wednesday. Again, we track time as what the sun does over the face of the Earth, and that's whether you're on Mars or whether you're asleep or whether you're in a theoretical rocket ship in some other galaxy. Time on Earth is just it's just tracking what the sun is doing. And so, we try to sort of, and I think this is why we have problems with our calendar, like leap year and the days not being exactly, 365 days. I think it's because we try to force time into our construct of it, as opposed to basing our construct of time on what the sun is doing, which ultimately that's all time is relatively what is the sun, where is the sun, and when is it coming back.
I look at time as a construct that's really been kind of, forced upon us. Like, we kind of have to deal with it whether we like it or not. I mean, I've gone to great lengths to kind of, divorce myself from that matrix, if you will, because in essence, the matrix is time, largely. And that may be an arguable or debatable point, but I think it's food for thought anyway. I've sort of come to that conclusion after lots of years of thinking about exactly, what defines this matrix that we're kind of in. Um, the extent to which this artificial reality kind of has been foisted upon us with all these institutions and structures and laws that regulate the way that we move and do things and the considerations we make about our lives and decisions that we're constantly having to deal with. And so, this is really, this whole Dateline thing. I know a lot of people will easily have a knee-jerk reaction that says, well, you can just explain it away this or that way. And again, like I say, they can easily tell us it's not a big deal because it's not a literal 24-hour time jump. It's just a necessary 24 hours. Again, we've got to adjust so that we come back into the current day that's already happening and understand. Again, let's get back to the basics. There's 24 time zones. The sun takes 24 hours to move around those 24 time zones. They're roughly 1,000 miles each. They're a little over, like 1,035, and that adds up to somehow this almost 25,000, right? 1,000-mile supposed deal. So,
Circumference.
yeah, I was gonna say circumference. I just said deal because it's not really a circumference.
I got you.
So it's like a flat thing, and it's still 25,000. We can safely assume because this, it seems pretty basic. They've measured, and hopefully we could easily confirm these time zones are pretty accurate. Hopefully at 1,000 or so miles, 1,035, and the sun again passing over them in 24 hours. It's just like a clock. The sun is just going around that circle, if we're really on a circle, and it's just 1 hour to the next, to the next, to the next. There's no 24-hour time jump suddenly when you're going around the circle on a clock. It's just 1 hour to the next, right? This is very logical, and it would, I don't know how else to say it. It would have to work that way, but it doesn't. So the question is why? And it literally is the line that divides east and west in a literal fashion when we're looking at the Mercator map. And there's so many other things we'd have to talk about with this, to where we'd have to build a case, like point by point, and go through the fact that, yeah, Giza, the pyramids of Giza are not just considered the geographical center of the world, but really more specifically of the land masses, but they do also say of the world. Very interesting that they would have been able to figure that out, but all of a sudden that makes total sense when you're looking at a square flat earth representation and considering that. And so suddenly Giza right in the center. Okay, now when we start to understand ley lines and all of this, how precise they are with having mapped that out, and how much it corresponds to the constellations, and how much all of these obvious historical monuments have been built on those ley lines and lining again in alignment with constellations. This whole system is just so mind-blowing, just so awesome and so incredible. I hate to use generic words, but if you could call anything awesome, I'm thinking this really qualifies very well. This earth we live on, right? It qualifies.
Yeah, it's a big, huge mystery for sure. And one thing that I've always, or not always, but certainly most recently had issues with is like, I guess this right here would be Hawaii, but other than that, you've got islands peppered through. But basically, you've got this whole, I mean, I guess you could almost say that's a third of the world, maybe even more, that's really nothing but ocean. You've got some sparse islands, you've got Hawaii. This whole world is nothing but oceans. And, as far as I know, degrees of latitude, or at least degrees of longitude, have been measured very meticulously in the northern hemisphere all the way around. I mean, this is where most, ancient cultures that were stargazers and astronomers and science, minded, you know, mapped out degrees of latitude and longitude based on the stars and based on, you know, very logical extrapolations. And these extrapolations can be utilized and sort of manipulated to our benefit in either model, in the globe or the flat Earth model. But the big point of contention that I have is that, especially when you get like well south of the equator, Australia, you know, degrees of longitude and latitude don't appear to match up to what they should be on a globe at this, you know, south latitude. Then you have this whole huge area where I would say this would be a big, huge assumption, because, I mean, honestly, especially the lower hemisphere, but even all this, I mean, we honestly can't say that anyone has ever mapped out and confirmed and verified each of these degrees of latitude and longitude. And so I think that, you know, we're given a bunch of misinformation, whether that's in the globe model, whether that's in the azimuthal equidistant model, or I don't even say it's a model, it's a map, because exactly like you said, Kristen, this right here, whether it's a square or a circle, and I know that you're not real keen on the circular map, so I definitely, you know, I don't want to associate you with this in any way, but one thing that I sort of played around with a little bit is putting Egypt in the center, because historically and even geologically, it's claimed that it is the geographical center of the Earth. I guess is that about it right there? Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you look at it, and I don't have it perfectly centered, let's see. I think we've done this before, but if you look at Egypt as the center as opposed to the North Pole as the center, then you get a totally different layout. And so maybe, you know, not to get too way off in the deep end here, but maybe we're not, I mean, obviously to me it's a flat Earth, but maybe we're not dealing with something as simple as just the circuit of a sun. I mean, for all we know, we could be dealing with fourth dimensional objects and experiencing them or viewing them in three-dimensional capacity, which allows us to sort of observe aspects of whatever the sun and moon and celestial objects are, but it leaves us guessing at the entirety of it, if that makes any sense. And I always fall back to the flatland Carl Sagan analogy as a sort of reference.
Oh, for sure. And oh, actually, I hope you watch Free Energy's latest video, for that matter, because he's explaining in a different way what he calls the space loop, which is his way of explaining how circumnavigation is possible, but he hasn't yet clearly defined exactly how this space loop sort of functions in physical terms. So in this latest video, he's attempting to try to make it more clear, and he's calling it the fourth dimension, and I'm not even going to begin to try to explain it. I hope people will just go to his channel and look at it with an open mind. And the other recent videos, he's talking about the universal transverse Mercator map, if I'm saying that right, which he makes an interesting case for, is how they're able to navigate by so accurately, because it's a gridded system where it's just breaking it down into 6 degrees of latitude, I believe, if I'm saying it right. And so that's a very interesting video, and his videos are a little bit hard to follow. It's a little bit sparse with the text, and he doesn't do any narration, and but his graphics are pretty much standalone, I must say. And the extent of his model, the comprehensiveness of it is quite impressive, but he still is fleshing some things out, and we'll just see what he makes of it over time. But he's definitely getting a lot more notice lately, and I just think a lot of these things need to be considered. And he's pointing to a lot of information he was able to uncover about the Egyptians and the Chinese, knowing that it was a square flat Earth thousands of years back, and a lot of compelling things, and pointing to the possibility that the AE map might be a bit of a planted sort of Masonic deception for when the flat Earth would eventually organically start to reemerge as the truth that we've come to understand it is once we've looked at the proofs that are undeniable. And regardless of the map, regardless of the shape of the orientation, the layout, the continents, all of that, it's about the experience that we have just living where we live every day. For me, it comes back to that. We can measure and see and observe and experience a flat Earth, and it makes so much more sense. And so, to me, the rest of it isn't the focus. However, we've come to a place after a year that this thing's been going strong, where people can't help but want to know more and want to have a bigger picture. And I've tried to mention to a couple of people, hey, if we came in a year ago and they hadn't given us a map, hey, we might have not been able to go along with this as much as we did. It's hard to say because we weren't in that position. But for new people coming in,
and
if we can't.
If I could just touch on that point too, and this is a discussion that you and I have had privately, and I know you sort of disagree with me, but I tend to think of things or put things in perspective in like a court of law, and I know that's sort of a silly thing because we all know what a joke our courts are, but there is some merit to the process in its ideal form. And so let's just give an example. If somebody's being tried for doing some sort of a crime, it isn't up for the defense to, prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the prosecution's theory or what the defendant is being accused of is wrong. All they have to do in order to win the case and get it thrown out is to present an alternate theory that produces similar results or identical results or solves the issue, sort of freeing the defendant of any implication of the crime by showing that, hey, this whole prosecution's theory is doubtful. And so if you look at the globe Earth heliocentric model as sort of the prosecution in this analogy, well, we as the defense, we don't necessarily have to come up with a working model right away. All we have to do is, first of all, show that the globe Earth heliocentric prosecution's theory not only has lots of inconsistencies and holes in it, but we also sort of need to present another hypothesis that can technically work. Now, the AE projection, again, it is a working model in many regards, although it does have its issues, granted. Now, a lot of those issues, however, I believe are inherently supplanted into our entire matrix of understanding the world, period. And so, like Mercator, we're looking at, I'm showing Mercator projection here, but he also had a, I guess you could say, an azimuthal equidistant projection, which showed the land beyond the north, which is sort of like the center, or beyond the north, 90-degree north latitude, which I guess I can probably pull up an image of that as well. But have you run into that at all, Kristen? The Mercator.
Well, clarify your question there for me at the end, because I started to think something else, that you were going somewhere else with that.
Well, I guess, yeah, I'm all over the place, aren't I? But no, I guess what I'm saying is like you can pull up this Mercator azimuthal projection map. I think I want images, and where is it? It's very, very weird looking. It's kind of looks like that, but no. Huh, where'd it go? They took it down, or am I just not getting it? Oh, I guess maybe it's Mercator. Did I spell it wrong? Is it UR?
I think OR is correct. And so, yeah, you started to ask me about the north, right, and the 90-degree thing, and I was not sure I could follow it.
Okay. Yeah, it's like Mercator came out with this projection. I promise you it's here. It looks kind of like that, but that ain't it. Ah, here it is, right here. And I've sort of been theorizing, like, and again, going back to the analogy, the AE projection sort of does a good job in terms of a defense of the globe Earth, because it shows that, hey, circumnavigation is not exclusive to a globe. The massive ships appearing beneath the horizon are not exclusive to a globe. You know, the two brothers, one circumnavigating the world west, one circumnavigating the world east. The one who goes east is going to wind up, you know, a day or however many days older than the brother who circumnavigated west, just because
Right.
one was going against the sun, so he experienced more lapses in days, and one was traveling in the same direction as the sun, so he experienced less lapses in days. Of course, the two twin brothers were exactly the same age. They had just subjectively experienced more or less days depending on their velocity relative to the sun. But I'm not sure why I got off on that tangent, but this sort of like this thing here sort of goes hand in hand with these ancient Norse tales and also more recent, possibly factual, maybe fictional tales of people who have apparently penetrated the far north, the 90-degree latitude. And in fact, it's not a point, but it's this huge area that you see here where sort of all of the, like this is the top of what? Canada. It's really hard to read, but it's a Mercator projection of the center, and he's got this sort of, I guess it would be what you would call Mount Meru or Mount Olympus, like this electromagnetic generator vortex, and all of these rivers that flow into the center flow up towards the north. So they change their typical direction and they all get sucked into the center here. And it's just weird that, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, Mercator, you know, he was a globe maker, but he was also, he came out with the Mercator projection, which is obviously a flat map, and he came out with this AE projection, which insinuates something beyond the 90-degree latitudes north. And so what this tells me is that Gerardus Mercator and the likes of him, they weren't dead set on any one model. It seems to me like they were looking at lots of different theories and looking at lots of different models, trying to figure things out. And at some point way later, you know, like think of Newton and the Principia and Columbus, you know, at some point it's like the globe theory took hold and became prevalent. And then, you know, fast forward to today where it's taught as fact. But, I mean, it's just like, I don't know, it's just so amazing how, yes, this is circular, everything that we're given is circular, the AE map is circular, the United Nations logo is circular. And so, I mean, I'm with you to an extent, Kristen, where if they show me a circle, I'm starting to scratch my head and think, okay, maybe we should start to look for a square just because of all the disinformation and, you know, think opposite of what they tell you. But anyway.
Hey, John, can I say something?
Over. Yeah, absolutely, man. Go ahead, rant over. I just go on and on, I know.
I just want to go back to this time zone phenomena with so and I want to put it in the perspective of them moving. So there was an old international dateline that had Pago Pago and Appia on the same side, and then I don't know when they did it, but they moved them to split them. So now Appia is listed. So I'm looking at, I have international time clocks up for 3 different locations. Appia being one, Pago Pago being the second, and then Honolulu, Hawaii, which is actually an hour ahead of Pago Pago, because those two are on the same side of the international timeline. And if they moved Appia, they moved that line, and Appia all of a sudden is on the other side. So when I look at the time, so it's 5 p.m. or 5:16 p.m. in Pago Pago. It is also 5:16 p.m. in Appia. Now, it has to be that time because of where it sits on the internet, on the side of this international date line. And to me, it's just arbitrary. If they move that date line to put Appia on the other side, before they moved it, it would have been the same time is Pago Pago, which right now, if the line was the old line, they'd both be 5:17 p.m. on Wednesday the 27th. But when they moved it, now they're registering the time there as 5:17.
And you really clarified a point that I haven't really been able to articulate, or maybe I have, but like something that I've been sort of trying to express is that time, in terms of like what we think of on a watch, it's noon. That's a human construct, whereas noon is technically when the sun is, roughly overhead. That's noon. And two places that are only 90 miles apart, unless there's something very bizarre going on there, then they're going to experience noon at about the same time. They're going to experience, twilight at about the same time. And so that goes for any two places on the earth that are near each other. And it's like, if we're going to keep track of time in terms of what the sun's doing, we have to do it in a cycle, because the sun is going in a cycle. Now, whether that's a circular cycle or a linear cycle is irrelevant. The sun obviously moves in cycles, and it actually moves in a very beautiful repeating cycle over a year with the analemma and all, and its apparent journey from Capricorn to Cancer and back. But all of time and all of what we perceive of, what time is it, is simply our reckoning of what the sun is doing, right?
So let me ask this question, and I've just never looked deep enough into it. Are the time zones split because of when this? So is that when the sun is at its highest spot, or is it when it's 12 hours from? So in other words, are each of the time zones set forth that when it's 12 midnight? That's where those time zones start. Is that the sun is,
No, the time zones are also, and this is a contemporary explanation. So I don't know how valid it is, but I mean, not contemporary, but the typical explanation is that the time zones are roughly based on that principle, but they do sort of zigzag them around, because they don't want, like, say, half of a county to be 5 o'clock and the other half of the county to be 6 o'clock. Or the same thing with a state. And so a lot of times you'll see the time zones sort of going along with state borders, just to keep things consistent from state to state, county to county. But at the same time, yes, they roughly do follow that principle where, and this is really what's so amazing about the flat Earth model period, is that every point along that meridian line is essentially going to experience noon at the same time. And that doesn't sound that impressive, but if you think about it, you're talking about all the way from, and this is theoretically, in a flat Earth model, all the way from the southern tip of South America, all the way north to Boston, up through Canada, even up to the very North Pole. All of those points, which is thousands and thousands of miles, are going to essentially experience high noon at the same point in time, more or less. And so that's really sort of intriguing in a flat Earth model, because the sun is so close, and we don't see that sort of propagation of the sun's effect going east to west nearly as far, nowhere near as far. And it's just, to me, it's indicative of there being some type of either, and I've said this before, but either electromagnetism or even, some sort of conduit or tendency for the, whether they're the invisible out-of-spectrum electromagnetic waves of the sun, or even the visible light waves, to traverse far more readily from north to south. And that's where we get this illusion that all these points along this vast meridian line are seeing the sun, about high noon at the same time. And so it's really confounding in the flat Earth model. And I think this is one of the reasons why, people sort of stuck with the globe. It's like, how is it possible to, for everyone to see the sun on this meridian line at high noon at about the same time? Oh, it must be really far away. But to me, I just think it's our misunderstanding of how, the operations of what's going on up there, 400 miles up, 1,000 miles up, whatever the sun's doing. I think that's the big mystery, but not to distract from the conversation.
Kristen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kristen, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So what is, I guess I'm just trying to grasp what your your concern in regard to this is because
I'll definitely reiterate. I will, believe me, because I understand what this is, a brain bender, and it's easy for people to just kind of go, well, what, it obviously isn't. It can't really be anything, because again, it's not a literal 24 hours that passes. Those two places are only 90 miles apart. There isn't any reason why we'd have to say that 24 hours passed to go from one of those places to the other.
Right, and
Unless there really is,
and I don't mean to interrupt.
And if there isn't, it wouldn't be happening. That's the thing. It's only happening because there's a reason. The question is, what is the reason? Because on the face of it, the new day starting there is fine, but that doesn't have anything that doesn't require a 24-hour time jump for a new day to start there at all.
I don't think
a new day starts.
I think they arbitrarily said it did. I just think they arbitrarily said it went from being Wednesday at 5:23 to now it's Thursday 5:23. And the reason I say that is because there was an old line, and they've shifted that line.
Well, I understand there is an old line and they've shifted the line, but they haven't shifted it very far. It's like they've made adjustments. What's happened is they've made minor adjustments, but this thing always divided the east from the west. That hasn't changed.
No, so, and I understand that, but using Appia and Pago as the example, where they were on the same side of the line until they decided to adjust it, all they basically did was tell everybody in Appia, you're a day ahead. You've essentially lost a day out of your lives.
Yeah, I understand. This is why I pointed out earlier that that these things have been by request, and that I found it interesting. I know I ran through a lot of points very quickly. It was a lot of information, and I'm sorry about that. But the other point was that they it's interesting that those two particular, that example of those two islands being 90 miles apart, that they're on opposite sides, that they are going along with being a 24-hour time jump between them, which is crazy, especially since I understand your point that it's arbitrary, where they can easily put them on one side of the line or not, and it doesn't matter. But it's not that simple. It isn't actually that simple. That doesn't answer the fact. Just because they can make adjustments like that, because again, you can make that adjustment because the time jump isn't literal, but you still have to incur that time jump. Now, even though it isn't literal, if it was nothing, you wouldn't have to incur it. So it's still something, even though it isn't literal. Literal meaning it isn't.
I don't think it is literal. I think time is something that man. So basically, I don't even think we really know where we are in time.
But that's a different conversation. Honestly, that is such that takes this to a totally different place. Where then I'm talking about something that is dealing with just physical time space. It takes 24 hours for the sun to cross over all the time zones. I've gone through this part before, I know, but let me repeat it again, just for whoever it's helpful to hear it again. It's really like, this is just we have to answer what's happening in physical time space as we know it that would require this 24-hour time jump, because I know it may sound silly, but if it was nothing, then it wouldn't be happening. It's really that simple. Oh my goodness, it's that simple. So we have to work on this and come back to have a conversation about it once everybody's looked into it, because frankly, until you've really wrapped your brain around it, because I do get your point about the arbitrary nature of it, where they can make these adjustments, but the point is still the point. We have to explain why the 24-hour time jump is necessary. And what I am offering to you is that the square flat Earth model answers why it's necessary in a way that the circle and sphere never can, because it actually doesn't work on a sphere or a circle. It doesn't work.
Kristen, this may help me to understand where you're coming from, because again, I mean, you and I have actually discussed this at length, and I definitely understand being frustrated trying to convey a simple point. And I'm typically pretty good at understanding things, but like I have been known to totally not understand simple points, and that's just That's
That's a
just
relief.
human
Thank you.
nature. But one thing that I would ask though is, okay, let's just say hypothetically that that the azimuthal equidistant projection is essentially correct. We'll not talk about sizes and distances, but we'll say that the sun is going in circuits overhead. Um,
Right.
if that was happening, what would
Yeah.
you predict, or how would you expect the times to be kept track of? I don't understand how we could have anything other than either an infinitely counting clock or one that resets every cycle.
I mean, it's like I said, it would have to work like a literal clock face. I wish I could find a simpler way, a different way to say it, but you know, the sun is again making a circuit, whether it's a linear path or a circular path, it makes no difference, but it's taking 24 hours to cover that circuit of 24 time zones that are roughly 1,000 miles each, taking 24 hours, right, to happen each circuit, each cycle. And this is how we track days. This is how we track time. That again is the physical aspect of time that we're dealing with, not necessarily physical, like, okay, it's in every sense of the word physical, but it's something that you try to pretend that time isn't happening. Good luck. Okay, so it isn't just in the mind. It's something again that it's part of the way that we deal with the structure and have a concept of history and of therefore a linear sense of time. Whether that's real or not, that's not something we need to go into, in the sense of there is really only this moment, even though we have a sense of time that is linear, where there's a past and a future as well as a now. There's still only this moment. As far as that makes sense to me. Again, time travel has never been proven. Parallel dimensions have never been proven. There's a lot of information coming out that suggests that they would like us to believe in parallel dimensions and time travel. However, and I mention them together because they're somewhat, if not totally interdependent, where you need multiple. You need parallel dimensions for time travel to be possible. The idea that every point in time would be existing simultaneously. Somewhere or in the same space as all other points in time. Either way, that requires parallel dimensions. Neither have been proven. So this time jump thing, again, I just hope people will think about it, and I don't mean to go totally off track here, but it's just, so I hope to bring it back to the point.
Well, and that's cool. I mean, again, my only question would be is just assuming that, let's call it a globe or call it an AE sort of situation where the sun is going in a circular circuit. I just still don't understand what would be the recommended method of keeping track of this in such a way that is somewhat predictable. And the only thing that I could come up with is what we've got, and that's to have, you could use the prime meridian or you could use the international date line. Now, I know that one thing that, Kristen, that you've touched on is that there is something inherently unique, and I wouldn't say supernatural, but something that needs to be studied further in terms of the international date line. And like where I'm left off at it is, okay, I'm going to have to go there in a freaking dinghy, and figure out what's going on.
Well, I think when you said your question the second time, then I hopefully understood what you meant. So I think, though, I already may have answered it, which is to say that the first function of the date line, because there's two distinct things that are happening there, again, the first thing is fine. That makes sense, and that could possibly be an arbitrary aspect of it, which is, again, it's where the new day begins, 12 a.m. That maybe could have been placed elsewhere. I don't know about that part. That's another question, whether that could have been, put somewhere else. But the other thing that happens at the date line is my question, this 24-hour time jump. Okay, and just proposing that if east and west are actually distinct directions, distinct sides of this, what the so-called Egyptians and ancient Chinese, so-called ancient rather, Egyptians and Chinese claimed to know from the research that Free Energy has done. I think a couple other people have confirmed some of it. I've confirmed a little bit of it. He's mentioned and pointed out that they've really scrubbed a lot of the square flat earth evidence online, and that would be for good reason. But he's pointed out that they long knew it was a square flat earth to finish that statement anyway. but also to point out that he uncovered evidence leading to his conclusion that it might be a Masonic deception in the AE map. And let me explain that a little bit further, why they would use a circle. A circle gives us another way of circumnavigation without them having to give away how we're really doing it if it's not a circle. If it's a square, there's something much more phenomenal happening, as I pointed to earlier, which if it is true, which if it's true, would completely change the concept we have of reality as we know it, such that, let me make a suggestion, that it would really open a lot of doors to our understanding of really perhaps who and what we really are and how reality really works. Meanwhile, we've been enslaved, and reality is dictated to us by people running a religion called scientism, and we end up depending upon them to tell us what reality is, how it works. Meanwhile, we're so disconnected from our own sense of knowing and all of the ancient wisdom that we're so now disconnected from. Obviously, ancient people had intelligence that we don't. We should know that by now, those of us who do research.
So can I ask a question in regard to the timeline?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think that this 24-hour shift actually happens at that timeline? That as I'm looking at these clocks, it says it's 5:33 in Appia on Thursday, and it's 5:33 in Pago Pago on Wednesday. Do you actually think that there's a...
I'm so sorry. I know it's such a confusing topic, but I've tried to make it real clear that it's not. I realize it's not a literal 24 hours that's passed. That's why it's the same time in those two places. They're only 90 miles apart. A time zone is 1,000 miles wide. So those two places are obviously, as you already showed us, the same time of day. They're not literally a day apart. So why would they be considered a day apart? That's the question. It's real simple. I hope it will become more clear as you start to think about this more, because there's no reason they need to be a day apart when they're not. It absolutely does not make any sense.
Well,
one day, listen, it has to work like a clock face. This is real simple. One day to the next, not only it happens in an hour, it happens from 1 minute to the next. It happens when the clock strikes 12:01. Suddenly we go from, what's today? Wednesday, my time. You've already just gone into Thursday, John,
yeah,
right?
It's been Thursday for 35 minutes.
Right. Well, that's a function of now we've gone into the next day at 12:01. Now that's necessarily the next day. The 24-hour time jump is completely a separate matter. It has nothing to do. We just showed you how a day is passed. It's passed every time 24-hour cycles to get back to 12:01 a.m. That happens once a day. When we go over the date line, it's a separate matter, where suddenly we have to lose or gain a day. And if you start to research this, I promise you, you're going to find random videos, random articles, random things, people philosophizing about what's going on there, and they don't really have any conclusions. And you can find little random science videos explaining it this way and that way, and there's nothing logical really about what they're saying. It just doesn't add up.
The way that I look at it is, and I guess this is probably just my stupid human way of looking at it, but in terms of, to keep it real simple, all we have is right now, so today, then we've got tomorrow, which is coming up soon, and then we've got yesterday, which just happened. And so we're always in that frame of reference where it's never going to be tomorrow, because by the time it gets to be tomorrow, it's today. And so you're always in this sort of infinite loop of now. So today is today, yesterday is yesterday, and tomorrow is tomorrow. Now, I guess what you're sort of leaning toward is, okay, it just turned from Wednesday to Thursday where I'm sitting, because according to the laws of time and where the sun is, it just passed midnight. Now I'm into the next day. But what you're saying is that these two islands, and one thing I wanted to comment that I thought was kind of weird, is that these two islands are constantly on, they're 24 hours apart, regardless of the conditions. It's just always set that way. Now, what I thought was odd was you would think that if they were going to adjust the international date line, they would adjust it so that those two islands would be in the same day. It really is sort of counterintuitive, isn't it, that they would adjust it to make it so that they are in separate days. And to me, that just gives me another point of reference where I'm thinking, okay, well, the people on the East are using this to their advantage in terms of possibly stock markets. I mean, everything boils down to money in most cases anyway, but I know I oversimplify it, but I do see what you're saying, though. I mean, that is a bit odd, that it's constantly, you know, Wednesday here and Thursday there, and regardless of the time, they're always a day apart. But, you know, again, I guess to me, if there would be a specific international date line, it should constantly be phasing throughout the season. Since it's at a fixed place, that's, you know, it's a bit of a conundrum. And I mean, I have to admit, and I told you this before, I mean, I do see where there's this sort of, there's some issues with this, but without, I mean, and this is just the, you know, the zetetic scholar in me, without physically, you know, studying these places, which is nearly impossible. Even that documentary that you had linked over to me with the guy who was talking about the flight from those two islands and back, from what he said, it was impossible to book a flight from one island to the other unless you were physically there at the airport. You couldn't book a flight online. You had to go there and buy the ticket. So I thought that was kind of weird. So, you know, I think there's definitely something up with this. Now, am I going to necessarily say that, you know, I'm going to jump on board with a linear model as opposed to a non-circular or, you know, azimuthal equidistant model? I'm not necessarily. Now, another thing that I'll mention real quick is that it's been stated about me by, you know, I don't need to mention any names, but that that I'm one of these flat earthers that is pushing an azimuthal equidistant projection. And I think that that's ridiculous because I've been looking at this thing really sort of objectively since the beginning. I think that we were all very much influenced by the azimuthal equidistant projection. Some people call that a model, but really that's just sort of a map to explain how things are not necessarily exclusive to a globe, and to that effect I think it does a good job. In other respects it falls short. Then we have anomalies like, you know, the Bermuda Triangle, and then you have these stories of these far southern and far northern excursions beyond the North Pole, beyond the South Pole, and then you have these anomalies like the international date line that, you know, it's sort of hard to wrap your brain around. But I think, Kristen, I think I finally got what you were sort of explaining when Jason mentioned that those two islands are on opposite days. But you know, man, I wish I had like $20,000. I'd just go to Pago Pago and check these places out for myself and see what's going on.
How does it fit more into a square model than it does? How does this international date line sort of invalidate the globe and the AE circle model?
Well, that part I've answered, but I'll just real quick say again, because they would have to work like a clock. Every passing of every one date, one time zone to the next would have to be an even increment of time.
But you understand that time zones are arbitrary, that they're created by man. It's okay. I know, I understand what you're saying, and I realize people make that argument, but it's really not that simple. The bottom line is we're still passing a certain number of miles, and it's taking the sun a certain number of hours to do that, and we all have an agreement that that's 24 hours, and that, you know, we have a certain number of days in a year, and we're living, whether it's true or not, in this year, you know, by the biblical historical calendar of AD, right? Okay, this is the agreement that we're under. We can, these time zones are as real gets for us. Whoever, whatever, you can't have the same time here as we have 3 hours away from here, and
so on, because it just wouldn't work. So we have these things called time zones, and they had to divide up the land mass evenly into these time zones to make sense with, you know, how the sun passes in 24 hours over them, and it works. So it's like it's a grid system, and they're where they need to be for us to track time, because we're dealing with time whether we decide to go along with tracking it or not, because the sun is passing time, and I haven't seen anything yet defy aging. I don't know if I should call it the law of aging or not, but it could be a law for all I know, the way it's working. So, I mean, this is something just, but to answer your other question, why does the international dateline, I'm going to sort of ask the question in a different way, but how does the square map work with the international dateline, which was the first part of your question? Let me try to make that more clear too. Because if we're on a square flat map, and then I cross that date line, and as I made it clear earlier, that date line is absolutely dividing east from west, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've got to suddenly make what I'm calling a space jump from one side of that map to the other. And now, in an instant, without it being recognizable to the human being, if this is what's happening, I'm just going to try to crudely explain it. We have suddenly space jumped 24,000-mile time zones all at once, and we're now on the other side. And 24 hours had to pass for us to again come back into the matrix of the current day time of that, you know, passing of the sun, that 24-hour cycle. And I know it's I'm not used to presenting this verbally, and it's been a few months since I've talked about it to the few people I did talk about it with. I have written a few posts about it on my Facebook page. I didn't even think to mention the name of the other day, but it's called the Flat Earth Inquiry on Facebook, and there's several recent posts about the dateline that kind of break down a couple of these key points I'm trying to ask people to consider, because I realize it's kind of a lot. And a lot of people are just kind of they're just like, you're kidding. But there's a good number of people that have actually liked these posts and had some favorable comments.
Well,
And I know,
I can tell, and I sort of looked at, and it is hard to monitor the comments on the show, but I'm seeing a lot of the typical arguments, and not to say that there's anything wrong with the typical arguments, because that's, you know, sort of the exact same thing that I sort of, you know, went to when first presented with this, and even still to a degree I lean towards. But there was one, let's just see, where is it? It was from, it's like this, no, that's not it. Okay, I'm a Rocketman says it's just an agreed to standard. It's positioned where it is because it's a remote location with little population in the area. You could put it anywhere, but you don't want to put it split in the middle of, you know, populated areas. And I would even go so far as to say strategically, if the sun, sorry y'all for the infinite sine waves, if the sun isn't actually doing perfect circles but is instead doing more like elliptical sort of, you know, I hate to use the word orbit, but an elliptical, you know, circuit, then it could very well be that that international dateline is positioned way out there in the middle of nowhere, because there's not a lot of people that are going to be observing the sun possibly doing some strange things in terms of, I don't know, apparently making a sharp corner or something like that.
Right. Well, that's a very key point too. In my investigation, that came up for sure. That is certainly, you know, interesting. How, as I did point out earlier, so briefly, I mentioned that it is the furthest from most of the land masses, that point. So that, yeah, if we're talking, you know, Book of Enoch, for people that go there, you know, just an interesting note that if the sun and moon can be going through some sort of gates, as they talk about, well, that's where, if there's something visible about it that the human could see, that's where the least amount of humans would be able to see it, because it's the point where, of course, the sun is the furthest from the most people, right? So, very interesting.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, there is some merit to that, that, You know, it is like this area here is just nothing but water. You've got sparse islands, so it is an ideal point for it, but there may be some other strategic reason for it, and as Kristen mentioned, there may actually be some physical or something that needs further research in terms of maybe it isn't arbitrary. Now, I don't know though. I just don't think it's a coincidence that it conveniently separates Russia from the United States, separates the East from the West, when technically, whether it's a globe or whether it's a flat Earth circular model or whether it is a linear, you know, some sort of a linear model, we're all very close to each other regardless in the grand scheme of things. But you know, when you start dividing lines and you know, calling, I don't know, this the East and this the West because of these dividing lines, I think it's just really more of a device to separate us more than anything. And that really does work on a very deep psychological level, more so than many people would think. But
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, that's obviously the story we're given with the kind of, you know, the West Wing narrative with the Peters projection map, and how it differs from the Mercator, and why the Mercator was set up the way it was, that they explained to the characters, and how it was to create this kind of imperialistic attitude, and that the first world nations were on top and so on, and had larger land masses relative to the third world countries that were actually much larger continents in the lower part of the map. And so, and then they end up flipping it upside down at the end of the presentation, and of course after they show the difference in all the land masses and how supposedly Greenland is only 1/14 the size of Africa and so on. They made several examples, but this is another thing I wanted to actually, speaking of that, and you're showing the Mercator maps again. Greenland, people can look into it. Greenland.
yeah, that's the Peters right here. I was going to blow it up and turn it upside down.
Oh, cool. And Greenland, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Greenland is not really 14 times smaller than Africa. So I hope people look into that too, because that would be a big debunking piece of evidence to that little cover, what might just be a cover story. I will suggest a possible cover story that they're saying with the Peters projection. Because see, if the Mercator map is more accurate than they're saying, then it's this kind of thing where it's hidden in plain sight. All along it's been there. And, you know, they are using it accurately for navigation. That is the truth. We're given this thing about the AE used for navigation. No, not really. So that's another kind of little, why are we being told that? I don't know. But, so...
Yeah, the AE is more used for like weather patterns, but you know, I suppose as long as you know how to keep your bearings, you could use it for navigation. But the Mercator projection is much more accurate, just simply because, and again, the Peters projection is essentially the same thing as the Mercator. It's just slightly more accurate, you know, according to the whole West Wing explanation. But essentially what they've done is they've just made sure that these east to west lines and north to south lines are constant angles, as long as the navigator knows how to keep his bearings. And so these angles of the continents and the angles of the east to west lines are relatively correct. But in terms of relative size and distance, everything is skewed, you know, increasingly so towards the poles, where this line all the way across the bottom is allegedly a single point stretched to infinity. Same thing with the top, but have fun finding the North Pole on any map. You'll only find Greenland.
You might want to search for us and look up the Universal Transverse Mercator. I hope I'm saying it right.
Okay.
And that would just will allow us to touch on this point again about the grid, the grid of the Mercator map being such that it works for navigation, and but it's right angles. It's, you know, I know it's a much bigger leap, the concept of a square flat Earth. I really know that. Like, nobody needs to tell me what a bigger leap that is. The other thing about the Mercator map that's really interesting is how there's different versions of it. There's the stretched out rectangle version, and then there's the perfect square version. And sometimes you'll tend to notice in general the rectangle version doesn't usually show as much land in the north or the south. But the true square, and I say true because looking into it more, apparently the Mercator is, the standard Mercator is the square version, and almost perfect square, not quite. It's just slight rectangle, but it has a huge, just absolutely huge amount of land in Antarctica, especially, and then much more north as well, because it doesn't cut off anything. In other words, when it's the square, when it's the rectangle, it seems they crop it north and south as well as kind of stretch it out, which distorts the land masses a little bit. So anyway, just some food for thought, some notes on that if anybody wants to look into this more, because it just would be much more exciting in some ways. Think of it that way. I like the idea of the circle. I'm not against the circle. It's very elegant. I like it in so many ways. But I do have some questions about the east-west being a circle, how much that really works. I know people could make a lot of theories for how it can work, and I'm not saying it can't work. But it also means north and south are in kind of all different directions relative to that circle of the east and west and direction. And that's not as simple as it sounds, maybe. If it sounds simple.
No, because technically east and west would be arbitrary, just depending on north and south. It's simply right angle to north and south. So north and south would be the actual true bearings, and east and west are just extrapolated from that. Right.
I know people are gonna think it's maybe okay. I may be very unpopular very quickly, but like this is another problem.
No, we love you, Kristen. Don't worry about it.
Oh, you're sweet, John. Thank you. I love you too. So
well, no, because and real quick, I don't think, and you mentioned you like the circle, and honestly, that's very sweet. But at the end of the day, I don't think it really comes down to what we like or don't like. Ultimately, it comes down to what is the truth, and
exactly.
So we're only going to find the truth if we look at all options, and so that's just part of the process. So power to you. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
For sure, no, not at all. It's wait, what was I saying?
Yeah, I know.
I just kidding. Well, I don't know what I was saying, but I'll say something.
Well,
yeah.
we were on the topic of the Mercator projection. I sort of did squish it down into more of a square shaped. Actually, this is the Peters. I squished it down to more of a square shape. Yeah, the Antarctic is always depicted as huge. The North Pole doesn't exist, essentially. And to me, this is very telling. It's actually supportive of an AE sort of system. Now, again, I understand the issues with the AE system, but I think a lot of that has to do with these far southern latitude and longitude lines being assumed, and I also think it has a lot to do with the AE projection warping this smaller area around the sides of the map. Now, it is a big mystery, and for all we know, it could be something in between a circle and a square, and I know that sounds silly, but one of the things that struck me early on, again, is 90 degrees north, 90 degrees south. Well, that's 180 degrees, and for some reason that screams triangle. Now, I'm not saying the Earth is a triangle, but perhaps the reason that we have 180 degrees north and south is because the shape of the Earth may be triangular, and then the path of the sun having 180 degrees circular, or maybe an ellipsis. I mean, I think of wild stuff. I'm not saying this is the case, but we have to start thinking outside of the box in what we know, and I think a lot of what we think we know is just really extrapolation and conjecture, so it's almost as if we have to start from scratch and actually put people out here in the middle of the frickin' Pacific where nobody's ever been and really start to measure these degrees of latitude and longitude using known methods to do so accurately, which is difficult.
Yeah, okay, a couple things. If you look up, do a search for a Mercator map, and you'll see a lot of the square versions I was mentioning that are actually almost a true square. And then you'll see that a lot of times there's a lot more land up north than the one you were just showing. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier, where the rectangular ones crop the north. And it's just weird. It just depends. It's amazing how much what they show to the north varies a lot. And I probably shouldn't say a lot more land, but a lot.
Would this be akin to the one that you're talking about, or maybe?
That's pretty close. And then if you scroll down, there's a number of square ones that'll pop up. They're
Like
just, yeah, that's
this one
one.
here, and look at how massive Antarctica is. I mean, it's always
Right.
massive, and all you ever see is Greenland. I mean, you never see a North Pole ever.
Right. And so this is very interesting that there's so much more north, but it still doesn't give you, again, I misspoke saying a lot more land, but there is obviously a much larger Greenland, right? And so whatever happened to the area, the land north of Greenland that we used to see is another story, another question. I don't know.
Right, right. Well, and see, this is where I know that it sounds sort of cockamamie, but this is where I've sort of come up with the idea that, again, the 90-degree north latitude is probably not just a single point, but a ring or even an ellipse that goes probably many, many miles around. And this would actually, I mean, as far out as it sounds, this would actually dovetail and jive very nicely with these tales of people who have apparently made voyages to the land beyond the north, where you get through the pretty harsh conditions, very cold conditions, and then it basically opens up to very tropical and actually like oxygen-rich and, well, pretty wild stories. But you know, this stuff is echoed throughout history, and even myths tend to have a seed of truth. But is it just me, or I mean, do you guys remember seeing the dang North Pole in maps? I mean, even look at this one, it shows you clearly that, I mean, this is, and I wish I could see it more clearly. I can't really see what
Is it not shown because the North Pole, there's no land there? They're just laying out where there's land, because the Arctic Circle is technically just a bunch of ice. There is no land.
Right. I mean, I guess that may be it. I thought that there was some type of landmass in the north, and again, maybe that's what they're hiding, because if you look back at these ancient, and they are ancient, these Mercator, and I had it up a minute ago, I've got it here, these ancient Mercator projections where you've got, oh, what did I do? There it is. This whole area in the north where the tips, you know, the northern tips of all these continents are surrounding it, but according to all these maps, this place here doesn't exist. And this place here just coincides with so many ancient legends that, I mean, you can discount all that as ancient legend, but the more and more we study ancient legend and ancient technology, the more and more we find that they were very, very intelligent and spot on and knew their schnizzle. They knew their stuff.
So is that is that supposed to be Greenland? The bottom.
This here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's possibly what that is. It's very hard to read. I'll try to blow it up some and zoom in. Even still, I can't read it. Yeah, it's very low res, but yeah, it looks like that might say Greenland there. Yeah, Greenland. So, but isn't it funny how everything, in terms of like, here's your typical Mercator projection right here. Wait, where'd you go? I hate this. I hate InDesign CS6. But you've got your Mercator projection here. It shows Greenland as being like just butted up against that. I guess that would be the 90-degree north, right? And just no North Pole. But then you have these other ancient maps, and even like the AE map showing. And then I've got my theory, which doesn't amount to anything. It is just a theory, that we're considering all of this ring here. Or maybe say, here's the Arctic Circle. So we're considering all of this ring here, which may be several hundred miles in just radius. But we're considering that whole ring there as a point, as the 90-degree north point. And perhaps when you travel beyond that 90-degree north ring, you're going to run into this fabled, you know, whether you call it Mount Meru or Mount Olympus, or all of these ancient cultures have, you know, the Garden of Eden, Atlantis, all of these ancient cultures have legends of exactly this. And, you know, maybe that's what they're hiding in the north, and perhaps what they're hiding in the south is that, you know, it doesn't just end. There's no bottom of a sphere. We don't fall off an edge. It's just, continues on. I mean, perhaps this physical plane is much larger than just the circuit of the sun. I think that's very subjective and naive of us to assume that the circuit of the sun is somehow the boundary of the entire world. I mean, of course, it goes as far south as Capricorn, and we know that there's a South Arctic Circle per se, but beyond that, there's very few people who have ever gone beyond that, Admiral Byrd apparently being one of them. And so it's just so very intriguing.
Looking at that the flat square rectangle map you were showing, I understand a little bit better now what you were saying, Kristen, that the sun, as it got to the far west end, in order for it to come out the other side, it would almost have to, on a square map, it would have to almost time travel to get to the other side, so to speak, right?
Yeah, this space jump. I'm glad you brought that up, Jason. This space jump would be, and it ties to what John was just saying at the end there, in a way. Oh God, because I won't be able to make sense of how, but it makes sense in my brain. Oh my goodness, it's getting late. I'm so sorry, but the space jump would be existing outside of the boundaries of time space as we know it. And there's Einstein's, one of Einstein's theories that's never been proven is that time and space are inseparable, that they're sort of part of the same fabric, if you will. But again, it's never been proven. And what I'm suggesting, and what would theoretically need to be happening here, is that space outside of the time zones would not be subject to time, which would make time and space separate still, which is what in essence they may be if they can never be proven to be inseparable. And so perhaps the matrix of time, as I was alluding to earlier, suggesting a concept of earlier, is really, and again, what I think the matrix, as we know, is largely made up of, is this thing called time that sort of controls our reality, is perhaps only really happening on this earth plane that we inhabit, but in the sort of dimension, if you will, outside of it, could be, again, a totally different situation where time is not does not apply. And so we could make that jump through space, why I call it a space jump, just the simplest thing I could call it, without the actual literal passage of time occurring. Would only be by way of, again, that space not having time apply to it.
Well, one thing that I'll say is, let's just assume, a linear model like this, and again, we're just theorizing here, and I'm having trouble identifying Capricorn and Cancer, but they're about, what, here and here. I guess this would be the equator, so Capricorn and Cancer would be like here and here. I'll just draw some guides just for a rough, what is that? That's the equator, so Capricorn would be about there. I mean, Cancer and Capricorn would be about here, somewhere along that line, and get on there, whatever, it's just about there, it doesn't matter, but whatever. So just drawing two quick circles. You got the sun, I'll make that yellow because everyone knows the sun is yellow, and then we'll just duplicate him and make him gray because everyone knows the moon is gray. Now, according to heliocentrism, they're far differing in size, but according to us, according to our perspective, they're essentially exactly the same size. Depending on certain factors, you might have an annular eclipse where the moon appears slightly smaller, but what's essentially going on, if you're looking at this in a linear model, is the sun is doing a daily pass. So let's say it's the southern summer. It's doing a daily pass across from here, but over time, over the course of a year, essentially what the sun does, if you were to sort of plot it out on a day-to-day basis, it does what's essentially a sine wave over the course of a year. Okay, and so if we're seeing that sort of a sine wave, and by the way, we see the same sine wave with the moon, but over the course of a month, if we're dealing with something that's beyond our realm of understanding, then I could potentially see a circuit occurring without there being any sort of physical loop involved if we're dealing with extra physical objects. Now, this is getting way out there in theory, but we can't. I mean, it's just as viable, if not more so viable, than a heliocentric model. But one of the examples that I give that makes this somewhat possible is when I plug my fan into the wall. That creates a circuit, but I mean, technically it is sort of going in a circle, but it's a linear circuit. The electricity is traveling in alternating current back and forth through that wire, very, very quickly. But it's a linear circuit, and so I'm not necessarily opposed to such a linear circuit, especially when plotted out. The sun and moon make such perfect sine waves, and by the way, when you have certain eclipse events, like say this is a solar eclipse that's visible here, you always have these perfect alignments with where the sun and the moon are according to their time and space in that sine wave. Now, does that necessarily mean that we should abandon the circular idea that doesn't involve this sort of space jump, as it were, especially for circumnavigating physical objects? It's pretty hard to wrap your brain around or accept without direct physical experimentation. And until that's done, I'll definitely, personally, I'll leave anything open as a possibility. But, basically, I guess you could call it the zetetic theory or the AE matrix, the AE model, although it is skewed to infinity around the edges, just like the Mercator projection is allegedly skewed to infinity around the top and bottom. There's issues with the matrix, but I mean it works in certain regards, and so for all we know, it could be a combination of these things, and then you go and look at things like what Randy Powell and those guys are doing with vortex-based mathematics, and there could be something far more complex, or maybe something very simple.
Indeed, and I loved your analogy about just an electrical device plugged into the wall and the way that works and the linear nature of that. That was an excellent analogy, really. And the sine wave thing too, pointing that out, wanted to track back to your mention of Free Energy's video about the stars, and that's really a brain bender, but that's in essence what he's suggesting about the stars too, is the sine wave concept. But it's just, I need to watch that one again myself, and so but that's the idea here, and so this connects to
I have a quick question.
Yeah, I'll get back to that, so I'll hold that thought. Go for it.
How does the 24 hours of sunlight in the Arctic work on the square map model? In the Arctic, how would that work if the sun is traveling across the flat plain east to west in the summer months? How would you have 24 hours of sunlight on a square map?
Well, the square map is where it allows 24 hours of daylight in the south, just like in the north. Whereas the circular map doesn't allow 24-hour daylight in the south, only the north, right?
I personally don't believe there is 24 hours of light in the south.
Well, I was going to ask you that first, because that's the qualifying question, really, because it depends, on what evidence we're looking at and what we've decided about that yet. And I haven't made up my mind about it myself. I do find it interesting that there's just a few videos on both sides of that one, and people will say that the ones about the north are real, but the ones about the south are not. But that's, how do we know? How do we know? I mean,
and if I could mention, I've seen a couple of the Arctic midnight sun video, time lapses, and they looked very convincing and believable. They didn't look at all fake. And then the one that I've seen in the south looked totally fake, unbelievable, and I didn't believe it even for a second. But I've also seen, and I've mentioned this several times, put it in several videos, Drew 77777777 did some observations over the course of a year, and it then took some extrapolations using date and time, and showed how the sun isn't acting like a spotlight, just sort of circling overhead, but depending on the season, the sun is sort of the waves of the sun are acting very sporadically, depending on the angle which the sunlight is hitting sort of our electromagnetic barrier, if you will. And so I could see there being what appears to be 24 hours in the south, but there's lots of accounts of sunsets in the southern summer when there shouldn't be. And so I'd have to agree with Jason that I'm not 100% convinced that there is the 24 hours of daylight in the southern summer solstice, while I am fairly well convinced that there is such a phenomenon in the northern summer solstice.
Well, here's another thing too. We know that there are places in Alaska that experience the 24 hours of sunlight. There has to be, I'm guessing, an opposite side of in the globe model, somewhere that would be the exact opposite lines of is it latitude, east to west?
That's exactly what they claim.
Okay, so there would have to be an exact opposite spot where it's inhabited by man, that they could show this this phenomenon happening, where you have 24 hours of sunlight just like you do in Alaska. So in other words, and I'm just using Australia as an example, you have to be in the Arctic Circle, so you have to be, I think it's within, is it 75 or 80 degrees towards the either extremity, if I'm not mistaken. Is there any land, is there any inhabited land there besides in Antarctica that's in, so I'm assuming that there's spots then.
It's really funny because if you look at really old Mercator projections, and maybe I can find it, it actually shows the southern tip of South America butting up against the South Polar area. So let's just see, first ever Mercator projection. I think this might be it. It's something like one of these. Here it is. This is the one that I found. I don't know, maybe, but you can see here pretty clearly. I meant to copy it. Let me go back, and that way I can blow it up a little bit. It shows the southern tip of, it's a pretty crude map, but it shows the southern tip of South America essentially butting up with, the Antarctic, but the degree south latitude, I think it's about 60 or something like that. So the Arctic Circle doesn't even begin to somewhere like way down here. So you have to be within the Arctic Circle to experience that so-called, midnight sun phenomenon. And the videos I've seen one video of the southern such phenomenon, and to me, it didn't ring true at all. It just seemed extremely fake. And again, the ones that I've seen of the North were fairly convincing. I didn't have any sort of issues with them, but I mean, you could call it confirmation bias, but I've got a pretty good eye for this sort of thing. I mean, we've all been playing video games and watching movies as they've progressed with technology for special effects and such. And I don't know about you guys, but I can pick out special effects and CGI pretty well, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
So
there's these other videos that are out now. I don't know how long they've been out, but these several stations down there. Do you think they're supposedly 48-hour loop videos the last couple days, and they're constantly putting them out? I mean, do you think they're just constantly faking them? It's just, it doesn't even make sense on a globe model that there would be 24-hour sun down there, does it? It's really with the tilt and
in the South Polar region.
Yeah, I mean, so that can't be. It doesn't. There's no motivation for debunkers to be, as far as trying to. This is the problem with this whole thing, is they think if they can debunk a 24-hour sun in Antarctica, they're debunking the flat Earth entirely. And they really might only be debunking a circular layout of a flat Earth theory. But because the flat Earth theory has become completely synonymous with the circular model, that's why the kind of the psyop of the mantra has been, well, if it's not a if you don't have the map, if that's not the map, which is the circle map we've all been shown, if that isn't the map, then you don't have a theory that's working at all. It's totally debunked.
Well, you know, and
even though that's not true.
what I would say too, though, is even if I saw real footage or went down to the Antarctic and experienced the so-called 24 hours of, you know, the midnight sun for 3 days, I'd take close observations of it, because from what it seems is that there may be that phenomenon for a few days in the southern summer solstice, but it's not like it is in the north. It's different, where you've got more of a diffuse light, and the sun may, you know, rise, and it may be risen for extended periods, but it does sort of dip beneath the horizon, yet it stays lit. And
Yes.
so
That's a distinction. You're right, and that could be explained by the difference in distance, I think, to the south, with, you know, being Antarctica, and how most of the land masses are to the north, you know, and so that maybe so. I just offer that possibility. I don't know. I don't, but it's
here's
very
something I
compelling.
found interesting too in this old Mercator projection, is if I'll box off this little area here, but you can see right in this little area they're showing that the Antarctic, I don't know if you guys had noticed this, but they're showing that basically the Antarctic comes way up to basically the equator, and it just so happens to be right along that international date line. And so I'm wondering, and remember, on the globe and on all the models, all this area right here is big, nothing but sea. I'm just wondering if they're hiding some tropical, I mean, this appears to be a tropical island with that butts up against the South Polar region, which is humongous. But isn't that interesting? I mean, Mercator, you know, he got most everything else right, or pretty damn close for the 1500s. But what do you guys make of this? And by the way, we've got 12 minutes until the live feed starts over recording, so we'll start wrapping up. But what do you guys make of this?
I'm not sure. I'm not. A lot of these maps are confusing, very confusing to me.
Yeah, definitely confusing, but I just think it's interesting that Mercator would put sort of, I mean, this would have to be basically a tropical island um, butting up against the South Polar area, just south of the equator and just east of the so-called international date line. So interesting. I wonder,
Very, very. I wasn't even paying attention earlier to how different this map is. In, as you mentioned a moment ago, how much less, or how much closer rather, the southern polar region is to the rest of the land masses, right?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if maybe, you know, the Antarctic is receding, or perhaps, you know, the southern tip of South America is a lot closer than we think, or maybe he was a little bit off, or maybe, you know, there's these theories that people sort of spread out all across the world because there used to be ice bridges and land bridges, and maybe even before a great flood there was more land to, you know, travel. Um, it's just so interesting. I love studying ancient maps, but this thing right here gave me pause when I looked at it, because that happens to be, you know, right in that big Pacific Ocean area, due east of the international date line, and butting up against the South Pole. I mean, not the South Pole, but the you know, continent of Antarctica. So,
Here's
wow.
another phenomenon that they don't really explain to us and nobody really asks is, why is Antarctica essentially a barren wasteland of just horrible weather? And when you get up into the North Pole and the Arctic, I mean, in the summertime, you have a massive retreat of millions of square miles of ice, and being a person who doesn't believe in global warming, I follow the melt season of the Arctic every year, and you lose millions and millions and millions of square miles of ice every summer in that region. You have wildlife in that region. You have a rebirth of plants and vegetation. You don't have any of that in the South. And if we're on a globe and we have an equator and the sun travels between Capricorn and Cancer, then we should have identical weather patterns as the seasons rotate from north to south. And we just don't.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point. I do agree.
Indeed, yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of I just, as you guys do, I have lots of questions that nobody really ever forces these people to answer. Everybody just assumes, okay, well, they tell us we're on a globe, so we're a globe. Well then, but I don't feel that way. I want these questions answered. Like, if we're on a globe, why is the weather different? Why does the southern hemisphere seem to have not as long a days in the summer than we do in the northern hemisphere? Lots of questions.
Yeah, I think that's pretty telling because, especially for a sphere Earth, you would have to have a bilateral symmetry in terms of seasons, almost perfectly in the north and the south. Now, granted that they claim that Antarctica has a landmass while the North Pole is scantily land. It's mostly just sea and ice. But I think that's a cop out. I think that you're right. I mean, and especially if you guys haven't checked out BS Detector, check out his videos. There's one he did fairly recently where he just brought up such an excellent point involving, if what they're saying is true about the globe and the sunlight hitting us all at the same angle, then if we're at a tilt, then we should have an equator here and an equator here, but this equator would not be getting the direct sunlight. So, even the own heliocentric explanation for seasons technically doesn't work if you actually think about it. And you're right. I mean, on an AE projection, and again, I always put the caveat that it's not an accurate representation of the face of the Earth because of this skewing of everything south of the equator, especially the southernmost hemisphere. But it does work in so many regards in terms of, even that sine wave from Capricorn to Cancer and back, and the moon follows suit, and even eclipses line up with this sort of model. And again, because especially in the north, these latitude and longitude lines are fairly well measured. It's just assumed that we live on a globe, and when you get south of here, they assume that all of these lines converge back into a point. But if you look at the documentations of ancient mariners who documented their voyages, and lots of evidence that suggests that the southern region is just much larger and wider round and more difficult to navigate and much colder and much more treacherous seas than in the north. And so, I don't know, this model, even though it does have its issues, it makes sense. I'm not going to rule out a linear sort of model just yet, because again, I sort of start with the assumption that once we admit that we truly know nothing is the beginning to the path of enlightenment. And so, to me, that really does apply to this flat Earth, is try to get rid of some of our assumptions and try to get rid of some of what we think we know, and perhaps things will be revealed to us if we just have an open mind. So we've got just a couple minutes to wrap up. So Kristen, if you want to just tell everybody real quick what you've been up to and where to find your stuff, and then we'll go to Jason for wrap-ups real quick.
For sure. I have nothing new to offer, really, and no definite plans of when I will. I hope to do another couple talks with you, and maybe hopefully eventually do get these videos put together with some of the footage I shot, and hopefully some better footage I hope to shoot. And I was joking earlier that I probably won't be popular when I was about to mention something that I then forgot, right? And then I finally remembered later, but it's probably too late to say what it is now, and so I'll save it for next time.
Well, I mean, if you want to be unpopular, no, I'm kidding.
I don't want to be, but I accept that I might be. Nobody wants to be unpopular, do they? Or
Well,
do they?
welcome to Flat Earth. I would say
Right.
I would say save it for next time for one reason, because we've got 4 minutes, and for the
Yes.
other reason, it's almost like I left my keys at your house, and it gives you a reason to come back over and hang out with us again. So.
That is true. I was not going to attempt to explain it. I was only going to mention what it is, but actually we'll just hold the complete suspense over it. I like it. Let's do that.
Cliffhangers. Everybody loves a good cliffhanger. And Jason, man, it's been awesome having you. What you been up to, man?
It's awesome being on here. Just doing the same research that everybody else is doing. I don't produce videos. I don't have a blog or anything like that. But what I do is I go all over and I listen to all the theories. I will look more into the line that we talked about tonight, the international date line, and see if I can wrap my hands around it and look more at the square model. And my questions again go back into how can we have 24 hours of sunlight if the sun is traveling, and I guess I'll have to figure that out on my own. But that's my contribution is continuing to research and question the globe Earth model that's been presented to us, which makes zero sense to me.
Oh yeah. The globe model is absolutely out. I mean, there's no way, and really the only thing that it's got going for it is just ignorance. Well, not ignorance. I mean, programming. I mean, and I was guilty of it for 34 years, so I'm no one to talk. But hopefully, the more that like minds like us. Talk about this openly, kick around different theories, get closer to the truth, show how silly the heliocentric model is. I mean, it's all a step in the right direction. And I also want to just real quick thank all of the live listeners. You guys are great. We wouldn't have a show without you. If y'all want to tithe, I do recommend it's the Shelter of God Sunday School. It's run out of a Facebook friend, or run by a Facebook friend of mine, Majida, out of Pakistan. It's a Christian outreach organization. It's sogs.com, SOGSS.com. Check it out. It's real easy. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so via PayPal to JohnElance at gmail.com, or on my fan funding page on YouTube. So we're down to the last minute. Thank you guys so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure and honor having the panel and all of you live listeners. So as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.
Thank you, John. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Kristen. It was nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you too, Jason. Thanks. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye. Bye, John.
Bye.